Emotional contagion loops are one of the most invisible yet dangerous psychological dynamics, where one person's mood becomes another's reality. It's not just that people influence each other emotionally, it's that once the transfer begins, it loops, it grows, and soon no one remembers where the original feeling started. A single anxious sigh in a room can spiral into a silent storm of shared dread. A burst of laughter can ignite a whole crowd into joy. But the real power lies in how manipulators use this loop to control emotional climates without saying a word. Emotional contagion loops. Our brains are wired with mirror neurons that don't just reflect motion, they reflect emotion. When someone nearby radiates stress, sadness, or excitement, the nervous system picks up those signals and tries to match. This is ancient survival coding. In a tribe, matching emotion meant safety. But in modern psychology, this wiring is a weapon. Narcissists, toxic leaders, or even charismatic influencers enter a room and project an emotion with precision, calm confidence, or passive panic, and others, unaware, absorb it like a virus. It's not manipulation by words, it's manipulation by mood. The loop begins when the emotion passed from one person triggers a mirrored reaction, and that reaction strengthens the original emotion, feeding it back to the source. It grows, it multiplies, like two mirrors reflecting endlessly into each other. People stuck in emotional contagion loops lose clarity, mistake someone else's anxiety for their own, and start making decisions based on feelings that were never truly theirs. The most terrifying part? Most don't even know it's happening because it feels real, it feels personal, but it was always borrowed. And unless someone breaks the loop, it becomes the dominant emotional truth in any space it touches. Predictive guilt structuring. Predictive guilt structuring is a silent weapon. It doesn't accuse. It prepares the battlefield in advance. This psychological tactic involves planting subtle expectations that, when unmet, will trigger guilt automatically, even before anything has gone wrong. It's the art of making someone feel bad for a future that hasn't happened yet, for a disappointment that was pre-written, for a script they never agreed to follow but suddenly feel responsible for. At its heart, predictive guilt structuring is about emotional preloading. A parent might say, "I know you probably won't call on my birthday, but I'll be okay," planting the seed of guilt days or weeks in advance. A partner might softly declare, "You're probably too busy to care about this," pulling the emotional trigger before the event has even occurred. The victim is left walking on eggshells, trying to live up to emotional expectations crafted not by mutual agreement, but by subtle psychological sabotage. This technique works because humans are deeply averse to guilt. The idea of disappointing someone, especially someone close, activates stress and emotional discomfort. By predicting failure, the manipulator gets compliance without even asking. The target bends over backwards to avoid confirming the planted prophecy. And the manipulator, they never had to make a direct demand. They just hinted at pain and watched the other person do everything possible to prevent it. Over time, predictive guilt structures rewrite relationships. Love becomes performance. Boundaries dissolve under the pressure of preventing someone else's emotional collapse. The manipulator doesn't need to threaten, they just need to suggest. And like clockwork, the victim reacts, not to protect themselves, but to avoid the unbearable weight of letting someone down for something that hasn't even happened yet. Inverted validation hooks. Inverted validation hooks twist the need for approval into a trap. Unlike typical flattery or praise, this psychological technique works by withholding validation, then offering tiny fragments of it, but only when the target behaves exactly as desired. It's not about making someone feel good, it's about making them need to feel good and putting the key to that feeling just out of reach. The hook is set by reversing the expected flow of affirmation. Instead of being rewarded for genuine qualities or achievements, the target is rewarded unpredictably only when the manipulator deems it useful. This scarcity of validation rewires the brain. What should be natural reassurance becomes an addictive pursuit. The target starts wondering, did I say the wrong thing? Or maybe if I try harder, they'll approve of me again. It's a loop of doubt and chasing, where the manipulator remains emotionally in control by controlling the dosage of approval. One smile after days of coldness, one compliment after hours of silence. Each tiny drip of praise becomes disproportionately powerful because of how rare and unpredictable it is. The mind adapts to this starvation by attaching even more deeply to the source. The less someone is validated, the more they crave it. The more they crave it, the more they behave in ways that keep the hook in. Soon, the manipulator doesn't need to ask for loyalty or obedience. It's already been trained. The target lives for the next flicker of acknowledgement, thinking that if they're just good enough, kind enough, or pleasing enough, they'll finally earn what used to come freely. But with inverted validation hooks, it never comes freely again, because once someone controls your sense of worth, they control your entire emotional reality. Ghost pattern reinforcement. Ghost pattern reinforcement is a chilling psychological technique where someone reinforces a presence by its absence. It's not what's said or done, it's what's withdrawn, vanished, and then echoed in subtle, strategic ways to haunt the emotional landscape of another person's mind. At its core, it's the art of making someone feel emotionally tied to someone who is no longer fully there. The ghost isn't a person, it's a pattern, a rhythm of connection, silence, then sudden reminders, and it keeps the victim emotionally anchored to a presence that never returns consistently, if at all. This method starts with intensity, love, attention, praise, given in overwhelming waves, then it disappears without warning. Silence stretches like fog, leaving the victim wondering, what did I do wrong? Just as they start detaching, a small signal arrives, a message, a glance, a song shared. It's not the return of the person, it's the return of the pattern. And the brain, wired to seek closure, latches on. It tries to make sense of the inconsistency. It fills in blanks. It creates stories. It tries to make the ghost real again. But that's exactly the trap. The manipulator doesn't need to stay. They just need to reinforce the memory of their presence at calculated intervals. This psychological looping keeps the victim emotionally invested in a version of the person that no longer exists or never existed at all. The reinforcement happens through echoes, past phrases repeated, inside jokes resurrected, old songs or scents strategically placed to trigger nostalgia and longing. Over time, the victim confuses the ghost for the relationship. They mistake the echo for reality. They hold on not to the person, but to the pattern, and the manipulator watches from a distance, knowing the hook is still set, even in their absence. Cognitive dissonance. Seeding. Cognitive dissonance seeding is a deeply destabilizing psychological technique that doesn't break a person. It fractures them from the inside out. The tactic involves deliberately planting contradictions between a person's beliefs and their behavior, their values and their actions, or their identity and their reality. The result? Emotional tension so uncomfortable that the person begins to question themselves, not the manipulator. It's not about directly confronting someone. It's about quietly making them live in a state where nothing quite adds up and blaming themselves for the discomfort. This technique thrives in silence and subtlety. A manipulator might praise independence, then punish it. They'll say, "I love how strong you are," and later withdraw affection the moment strength is shown. Or they'll push someone to speak their truth, only to react with guilt, anger, or stonewalling when that truth is inconvenient. The victim begins to feel torn, confused, unable to trust their instincts, because every choice leads to disapproval, yet doing nothing leads to abandonment. Over time, this internal contradiction grows unbearable. The brain cannot tolerate prolonged dissonance. It needs harmony between belief and action, so the victim adapts, not by confronting the abuser, but by rewriting their own reality. Maybe I am overreacting. Maybe I am the problem. Maybe this is love. These are the seeds taking root. The more conflict they feel inside, the more they twist their mind to protect the relationship rather than themselves. And the manipulator, they don't have to control behavior directly. They just plant a contradiction, a subtle hypocrisy, a message that says, "You're free to choose, so long as you choose what I want." The real damage of cognitive dissonance seeding is that it turns the victim into their own jailer, rewriting their thoughts, editing their emotions, and silencing themselves, all to make the pain make sense. Sympathy, currency exchange. Sympathy currency exchange is a psychological tactic where emotional pain is turned into leverage, where suffering becomes a form of currency used not for healing, but for control. The manipulator doesn't ask for sympathy outright. Instead, they create situations where others feel compelled to offer it. They share wounds strategically, often repeatedly, not for connection, but for transaction. Every tear becomes a coin. Every story of hardship becomes a debt. And the more someone offers comfort, the more emotionally indebted they become. At first, it feels like vulnerability. Someone opens up, confesses their past, reveals their scars. It draws empathy, connection. But over time, the stories don't change. They intensify, and they always return at the same moments when the manipulator is being questioned, challenged, or held accountable. Suddenly, criticism is cruelty, boundaries are betrayal, and kindness becomes a contract no one remembers signing. The one who comforts becomes the one who must keep comforting, no matter how much is taken. This technique works because humans are wired to respond to pain with care, but the manipulator twists that instinct into obligation. They turn past suffering into present control. They remind others of how broken they are, how much they've endured, and how deeply they've been hurt, until any attempt to disengage feels like abandoning a wounded soul. The emotional rescuer begins to feel like the villain for trying to step away. The cruelty is hidden behind sorrow. Sympathy becomes manipulation disguised as need, and once someone is emotionally entangled, their own sense of compassion becomes the leash. They don't realize they're being used because all they see is someone hurting. But the more sympathy they offer, the more power the manipulator gains. Because in this exchange, pain isn't shared, it's weaponized. Hidden mirror conditioning. Hidden mirror conditioning is a covert psychological method where someone reflects your traits, values, or desires back to you, but only selectively and only to gain your trust, not to genuinely connect. It feels like chemistry, it feels like destiny, but it's engineering. The manipulator watches, listens, and learns, not to understand you, but to create a mirror so familiar you let your guard down completely. And by the time you realize it, you're no longer falling for a person. You're falling for a carefully constructed reflection of yourself. At first, it feels magical. They finish your sentences. They share your passions. They seem to get you in a way no one else ever has. But what's really happening is targeted feedback. They notice your expressions when you light up. They catalog the things that matter to you. Then they mirror those qualities back, layer by layer, crafting a persona designed to resonate with your deepest identity. It doesn't just create closeness, it creates dependence, because suddenly you feel seen, understood, validated. The hook is set when that mirror becomes a source of emotional stability, but slowly the reflection changes. They start shifting values, dismissing your dreams, questioning your character, all while claiming they're just being honest. And because they once mirrored you so perfectly, you trust their judgment more than your own. That's the trap. They built their identity around yours so you'd rely on their approval. And when they begin to distort that mirror, you begin to question the very image of who you are. Hidden mirror conditioning works because people crave connection, but when connection is manufactured, it becomes a tool of control, not love, not truth, just illusion, one perfectly tailored to reflect everything you ever wanted, until you forget how to see yourself without it. Projected vulnerability traps. Projected vulnerability traps are psychological snares disguised as honesty. At first glance, they look like moments of raw truth, tearful confessions, trembling admissions, soft stories of past wounds. But beneath the surface, these aren't genuine cries for connection. They're calculated exposures designed to trigger a response. The goal isn't healing, it's to provoke protection, guilt, or loyalty from the listener by appearing weak, fragile, or broken at precisely the right moment. The manipulator doesn't simply share pain, they perform it. They reveal just enough to stir deep empathy, often during emotionally high-stakes moments when they fear losing control of the narrative. A toxic partner accused of wrongdoing might suddenly open up about childhood trauma. A manipulative friend confronted for betrayal might crumble into tears about feeling abandoned before. These aren't random confessions. They're strategically placed shields, deflecting blame, reversing roles, and forcing others to become the caretaker instead of the confronter. What makes projected vulnerability so dangerous is its emotional weight. The victim often feels cruel for continuing to push back. It feels heartless to stand firm in the face of such visible pain. So they soften, they backpedal, they abandon their truth to accommodate the pain of someone else. The trap has sprung, not by force, but by empathy. The real damage is long-term. Once trapped, the victim becomes emotionally responsible for the manipulator's well-being. They stop setting boundaries, fearing they'll hurt the person who appears so damaged. They start managing emotions that don't belong to them. And over time, they forget what their original hurt even was, because every confrontation ends with them comforting the very person who wounded them. In this reversal, the manipulator never has to change. They just have to look like they're trying. Nostalgia-triggered anchoring. Nostalgia-triggered anchoring is a psychological technique that turns memories into emotional handcuffs. It works by associating a specific person, place, or behavior with moments from the past that once felt safe, magical, or deeply meaningful. The manipulator doesn't just remind you of the good old days, they build a trap around them. Suddenly, they're not just a person in your life, they're a portal to something you're terrified to lose again. It starts with subtle callbacks. A song you once loved suddenly plays when they walk in. They bring up an old joke at just the right moment. They recreate a gesture, a phrase, a ritual from a moment when you felt completely seen. And just like that, your brain floods with warmth. Your body softens. You feel connected, anchored, not to the present reality, but to a past you never fully healed from. It doesn't matter how toxic things have become. The memory tastes like home, and that's what makes it so dangerous. The manipulator uses these nostalgic cues like tools, time to silence doubt, reignite attachment, or override your instincts. When things get tense, they might show you an old photo or mention when things were easier. You don't want to walk away because walking away feels like losing that memory all over again. The hook isn't in the person, it's in the feeling they trigger. And once that association is cemented, it's hard to tell whether you're in love with who they are or who they used to be. Nostalgia blurs reality. It romanticizes pain and disguises manipulation as meaning. In the hands of someone skilled, it becomes the perfect anchor because it doesn't pull you forward. It keeps you tethered to a version of the past that no longer exists and to a person who knows exactly how to use that against you. Reverse empathy drain. The reverse empathy drain is a psychological inversion where the one who gives comfort ends up emotionally depleted, while the one receiving it gains control. It's not about sharing pain, it's about extracting energy under the disguise of connection. the manipulator doesn't demand power outright. Instead, they create an endless cycle of emotional need, making the empath feel like walking away would be a betrayal. But every time the empath gives comfort, they lose a piece of themselves, while the manipulator becomes stronger, more entitled, and less accountable. This dynamic starts subtly: a small crisis, a bad day, a long conversation filled with sighs and stories. And of course, the empath listens. They care. They want to help. But the problems never end. The pain never moves. The emotional weight is never shared. It's offloaded. The manipulator doesn't seek understanding. They seek release. They treat the empath like an emotional landfill, a place to discard feelings without resolution or change. What makes this drain so insidious is that it often masquerades as intimacy. The manipulator might even thank the empath, call them their rock or safe space, reinforcing the illusion that this is mutual. But it isn't. The empath begins to feel chronically exhausted, guilty for setting boundaries, and increasingly responsible for moods that aren't their own. They stop expressing their needs. They stop sharing their burdens because they've been conditioned to believe that their feelings matter less. Over time, the drain deepens. The empath shrinks in silence, losing clarity, confidence, and emotional autonomy. Meanwhile, the manipulator thrives, not by healing, but by shifting their emotional load onto someone else again and again. The roles become fixed. One feeds, one empties, and the longer it goes unrecognized, the harder it becomes to remember that empathy should feel like connection, not collapse. Micro-mirroring entrapment. Micro-mirroring entrapment is a stealth-level psychological technique that operates below conscious awareness, yet it can completely override someone's sense of safety, trust, and personal control. Unlike obvious forms of mirroring, this method relies on barely noticeable behavioral mimicry, subtle shifts in tone, body language, and rhythm designed to mirror someone so precisely they never detect the manipulation, only the emotional pull. It doesn't shout, "You can trust me." It whispers it directly to your nervous system. What makes micro-mirroring so powerful is its invisibility. A manipulator doesn't need to copy you overtly. They may slightly tilt their head when you do, match the pace of your speech, blink in sync, echo your laughter a half-second late. These tiny gestures are picked up not by the thinking mind, but by the subconscious. And that's the danger, because your body begins to feel connection and safety long before your conscious mind asks why. That connection doesn't come from compatibility. It comes from strategic mimicry. Once your nervous system associates the manipulator with familiarity and ease, your guard lowers. You feel understood, even bonded. But the trap isn't in the bonding itself. It's in what follows. Once trust is established through micro-mirroring, the manipulator begins to pivot. They shift the rhythm, withhold the mimicry, create just enough dissonance to make you chase the connection you once felt. And because your body already felt it so strongly, you assume the problem must be you. You try harder, open up more. Meanwhile, they control the entire emotional temperature of the room. The scariest part of micro-mirroring entrapment is that it doesn't require cruelty, deception, or even words. It hijacks the deepest, most primitive parts of the human brain, turning subtle mimicry into invisible chains and making the person you trust most the one who quietly programmed your trust in the first place. Habitual disempowerment, nudging. Habitual disempowerment nudging is the psychological erosion of self-belief, done not through overt control, but through a slow drip of subtle suggestions, small corrections, and constant underestimations. The manipulator doesn't need to yell, insult, or dominate. They simply make the target second-guess themselves, one nudge at a time. It's the quietest form of sabotage, disguised as concern, feedback, or even love. And yet, it's devastatingly effective. The power of this technique lies in repetition. A partner might say, "Are you sure you want to wear that?" A friend might ask, "You really think you can handle that job?" A parent might softly murmur, "You've always been sensitive." No attack, just doubt. Doubt served warm and frequent until the target no longer trusts their own instincts. The manipulator positions themselves as the voice of reason, while quietly reshaping the other's sense of self into something smaller, more hesitant, easier to control. Each nudge seems harmless on its own, but over time, they accumulate. The target begins deferring decisions, seeking approval, walking cautiously through their own life. Confidence isn't stolen, it's discouraged. Autonomy isn't broken, it's redirected. The person still moves, but only where they've been subtly pushed to move. The danger of habitual disempowerment is that it's hard to prove. The manipulator can always say, "I was just trying to help," or "You're overreacting." And because the damage was delivered in whispers, the victim starts to question their own perception. They blame themselves for feeling small, but they weren't born unsure. They were taught gently and repeatedly that they should be. This technique doesn't destroy with force. It weakens with doubt, until eventually the strongest voice in the target's mind, the one that should be their own, is just an echo of the person who made them feel incapable. Scarcity-induced identity. Bending scarcity-induced identity bending is a psychological manipulation so subtle it feels like self-discovery, when in truth it's self-erasure. It works by depriving someone of emotional, relational, or psychological nourishment until their sense of self begins to contort in order to survive. The manipulator doesn't tell the victim who to be. They simply create a desert so dry that any drop of approval, attention, or affection becomes a lifeline. And to keep that lifeline, the victim will slowly twist their identity into whatever shape gets them more of it. At its core, this method exploits one of the deepest human needs, the need to be seen, valued, and emotionally safe. But instead of offering these freely, the manipulator offers them in fragments, intermittently, and with conditions. One day, warmth, the next, withdrawal. Praise becomes unpredictable, affection becomes transactional, and over time, the target, starved for consistency, begins bending. They laugh a little less loudly. They question their preferences. They shrink parts of themselves that once felt alive, not because they were asked to, but because staying whole feels dangerous when acceptance is given in rations. The power of this technique is in its pacing. It doesn't break the person overnight. It wears them down until adaptation feels like authenticity. The victim will often say things like, "I've changed, I'm just more chill now," not realizing that what they've lost isn't mood, it's self. And the worst part? The manipulator doesn't even have to criticize. They just have to disappear when authenticity appears. They train the person to become easier to love by withholding love from who they truly are. Scarcity-induced identity bending turns selfhood into a currency, negotiated, edited, and reshaped until the original version no longer recognizes itself in the mirror, not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't what the drought demanded. Nonverbal credibility inversion. Nonverbal credibility inversion is a dark psychological maneuver where the manipulator flips the natural signals of authority and trust without saying a single word. It's not about what is said, but how the body says it. Through carefully crafted posture, eye contact, micro-expressions, and silence, the manipulator radiates calm certainty, even when lying. Meanwhile, the target, who may be telling the truth, begins to appear unsure, defensive, or emotional. The result, reality is overturned. The liar seems honest. The honest seems unstable. Humans are biologically wired to read cues. We associate calmness with truth, eye contact with sincerity, and stillness with confidence. But the manipulator knows this and uses it against others. They practice restraint while subtly agitating their opponent. They blink less. They speak slowly. they keep their body still, and then they watch as their target, nervous from being disbelieved, begins to stammer, fidget, or over-explain. It's not the truth that wins, it's the appearance of it. This technique is devastating in arguments, negotiations, and gaslighting. The manipulator never needs to raise their voice. Instead, they quietly place the burden of proof on the other person, whose rising emotion then discredits them in real time. The more the target tries to convince or defend themselves, the more guilty they look, because composure, not content, becomes the measure of credibility. Over time, this inversion rewires perception. Friends side with the calm one. Authority listens to the steady voice, and the person speaking from pain is dismissed as unstable or dramatic. The manipulator wins not by proving anything, but by mastering how disbelief looks. And in a world where people trust what they see more than what they hear, that's often all it takes to flip the truth on its head. Authenticity guilt insertion. Authenticity guilt insertion is a psychological tactic that makes people feel ashamed of being real. It doesn't punish them directly. It teaches them, slowly and consistently, that honesty leads to harm. Every time they speak their truth, show a raw emotion, or reveal a part of themselves that doesn't conform to expectation, the manipulator responds not with violence, but with withdrawal, subtle judgment, or wounded silence. The message isn't screamed, it's implied. Your real self is too much. This tactic works by emotionally punishing vulnerability. A person shares a boundary, and suddenly the room goes cold. They express anger, and the manipulator looks heartbroken instead of responding. They admit fear, and it's greeted with a long pause and a change of subject. Over time, the victim begins to flinch at their own honesty. They learn to dilute their emotions, to wrap their truth in smiles, to say, "It's fine," when it's not, because experience has taught them that being real comes with a cost. The most disturbing part is that the manipulator often claims moral high ground. They frame the victim's truth as selfishness, or rudeness, or insensitivity. So now, being authentic doesn't just feel risky, it feels wrong. The target starts internalizing guilt for expressing normal emotions. They become the peacekeeper, the adapter, the one who softens their tone and rewrites their opinions just to avoid making anyone uncomfortable, not realizing that the discomfort was the design, not the consequence. Authenticity guilt insertion creates a world where silence feels safer than self-expression. It doesn't just suppress the voice, it teaches the voice to blame itself for speaking. And in that quiet, manipulated guilt, the person begins to vanish, not by force, but by slow self-erasure, masked as emotional maturity. False feedback loops. False feedback loops are one of the most deceptive tools in dark psychology, where the manipulator creates a self-reinforcing system of belief by controlling both the action and the reaction. It's not about telling someone what's true, it's about making them feel like the world is confirming what the manipulator wants them to believe. The victim isn't forced into doubt, they're subtly proven wrong by orchestrated outcomes that seem natural but are anything but. The loop begins when a false narrative is introduced. You're always overreacting, or no one takes you seriously. Then, without the victim realizing it, the manipulator crafts situations that validate that claim. They provoke emotional responses, then point to them as proof of instability. They isolate the victim from others, then say, "See, you're alone because people don't like your energy." The victim sees the feedback, real silence, real tension, real distance, and starts to believe the lie must be true. This manipulation is effective because it uses the environment as evidence. The target isn't just told something, they experience it. But what they don't see is how their reality was rigged behind the curtain. Reactions were manipulated, social cues were engineered, triggers were planted in advance. The feedback feels organic, but it's artificial. It was never neutral. Over time, the victim internalizes the message. They stop questioning the narrative. They adjust their behavior, thinking they're adapting, when in truth they're complying. The false loop tightens, every reaction reinforcing the belief planted at the start. The manipulator steps back, no longer needing to convince, because the world now appears to do the convincing for them. And the victim? They stop resisting not because they were forced to, but because they saw the evidence and believed it was real. Uncertainty framing is a psychological manipulation that destabilizes a person's inner compass by keeping them in a constant state of doubt, not just about what's true, but about what's safe, what's real, and who they can trust. The manipulator doesn't need to lie outright. All they have to do is inject just enough ambiguity, just enough contradiction to make the victim start questioning everything, including themselves. It's not deception through denial, it's erosion through confusion. The technique works because the human mind craves clarity. Certainty gives us control, but when someone you trust keeps shifting the goalposts, your brain doesn't rebel, it adapts. One day, they love your passion. The next, it's a little too intense. One moment, you're praised for honesty. Later, the same words are used against you. These contradictions aren't accidents. They're calculated. The manipulator blurs the lines on purpose, making emotional reality unstable. You begin tiptoeing through conversations, analyzing reactions, second-guessing your memory, wondering if you're being too sensitive or not sensitive enough. The chaos becomes the control. In this frame of constant uncertainty, the victim becomes increasingly dependent on the manipulator for interpretation. Was I too harsh? Did I misunderstand? What do you need from me? And the answer, always, is just a little more bending, a little more pleasing, a little less self. Because in uncertainty framing, truth isn't fixed. It's what the manipulator says it is in that moment. This psychological fog trains people to ignore their instincts, to question their clarity, to seek emotional shelter, not within themselves, but in the very person who destabilized them. Uncertainty becomes the new certainty, and the manipulator becomes the only constant, because they're the ones creating the storm and holding the only umbrella. Energy depletion mapping. Energy depletion mapping is a psychological tactic where a manipulator carefully identifies and exploits the exact routines, people, and conversations that drain their target's mental and emotional energy. It's not just about controlling actions, it's about wearing someone down systematically until their will is too tired to resist. This isn't done with screaming or force, it's done with timing, repetition, and strategic emotional friction that slowly unravels a person from the inside out. At the core of this technique is observation. The manipulator watches when the target is most responsive, when they're exhausted, when they're least likely to argue. They learn what triggers stress, what drains joy, what pulls attention. Then they begin to insert themselves into those weak spots. A difficult conversation is always initiated late at night. An overwhelming demand comes during the busiest work hours. Passive-aggressive comments appear right after the targets had a long day. The pattern isn't obvious at first, but it's precise. As this continues, the victim begins to feel chronically fatigued, but can't quite explain why. They may still sleep, still eat, still function, but the energy to think clearly, to defend themselves, to dream or desire, that fades. The manipulator then becomes the only constant left, the only one who understands. The very source of exhaustion now poses as the solution to it. The cruelty of energy depletion mapping lies in its subtlety. The damage isn't dramatic, it's cumulative. A person doesn't break all at once, they dissolve. Confidence becomes compliance, boundaries blur, decisions are handed over, not because the victim is convinced, but because they're just too tired to keep fighting. And the manipulator? They never had to overpower, they just had to outlast. The victim superiority effect. The victim superiority effect is a manipulative, psychological weapon disguised as moral innocence. It's the tactic of claiming perpetual victimhood not to seek understanding, but to gain dominance by weaponizing sympathy, silencing dissent, and shifting all accountability onto others. It's not about healing, it's about control. The person using this technique positions themselves as the one who's always hurt, always misunderstood, always wronged, no matter the facts, no matter the harm they cause in return. At its core, this effect turns the natural human impulse to protect the wounded into a blind loyalty trap. The manipulator tells you about their past pain, their betrayals, their wounds, real or exaggerated. And at first, it draws compassion. But over time, something darker happens. Every disagreement becomes an attack. Every boundary you try to set becomes a new way you've hurt them. Your frustration becomes abuse. Your honesty becomes cruelty. Because if they are always the victim, then by default, you are always the perpetrator. This flips emotional power upside down. You find yourself apologizing when you're the one in pain. You censor yourself to protect their narrative. You start to doubt your own experiences, because how could someone so wounded be the one doing damage? That's the trick. The person using the victim superiority effect isn't asking for help. They're asking for submission. They cast themselves as the fragile one, but behind that mask is often a ruthless need for control disguised as innocence. The true danger lies in how defenseless this dynamic makes the target feel. If you try to call it out, you become the villain. If you stay quiet, you suffocate under guilt. And slowly, invisibly, you begin to disappear, not because they overpowered you, but because they convinced everyone, including you, that hurting them is the worst crime you could ever commit, even when it's just telling the truth. Emotional debt installation. Emotional debt installation is the psychological tactic of creating invisible IOUs in the minds of others, where every act of kindness, every favor, every moment of support isn't truly a gift, but a silent investment waiting to be collected. On the surface, it looks like generosity, a helping hand, a thoughtful gesture, but underneath, the manipulator is keeping score, and the emotional cost comes later when the victim is too entangled to refuse without guilt. This technique begins with strategic overgiving. The manipulator might show up when no one else does, offer solutions without being asked, or consistently insert themselves into moments of vulnerability. It feels like loyalty, it feels like care, but slowly the debt begins to take shape. Subtle reminders creep in. After everything I've done for you, or I dropped everything when you needed me. Suddenly, the support that once felt warm begins to feel heavy. Obligations are no longer optional. They're emotional currency expected to be paid back. The trap works because it mimics intimacy. The manipulator creates the illusion of selflessness, making the victim feel special, chosen, understood. But as soon as the victim asserts independence or says no, the emotional invoice is slammed down. They're made to feel ungrateful, selfish, disloyal. The love they thought was unconditional now comes with terms they never agreed to. Over time, this false generosity erodes agency. The victim stops asking for help, fearing the debt it brings. They begin to comply out of guilt, not love. And the manipulator, they keep giving, not to empower, but to bind. Because in this dynamic, every gift is a chain, every favor, a future demand, and every thank you is one step deeper into a prison built from kindness that was never free. Selective silence. Manipulation, selective silence. Manipulation is a calculated psychological tactic that turns absence into punishment and silence into dominance. It's not the silent treatment, it's far more surgical. The manipulator doesn't go cold for no reason. They go silent strategically at moments that matter most, when emotional intimacy is forming, when accountability is needed, or when control feels threatened. They disappear, not physically, but emotionally, just long enough to make you feel unsure, unsteady, and desperate to restore the connection. This form of manipulation preys on the human need for resolution. When someone you care about suddenly withdraws in the middle of a vulnerable moment, your nervous system panics. You replay the last thing you said. You wonder if you crossed a line. You send another message. You apologize just in case. And that's exactly what the manipulator wants, because the silence isn't confusion, it's conditioning. A quiet punishment designed to teach you one thing: when you speak your truth, when you express a need, when you set a boundary, you lose them. Selective silence works because it creates emotional starvation. The warmth they once offered is suddenly gone, and the void it leaves is loud. When they finally re-engage, they do so on their terms, subtly rewarding compliance and ignoring the rupture they created. No explanation, no accountability, just a cold reset, forcing you to act like nothing happened or risk another freeze-out. It's psychological terrorism wrapped in calm. Over time, this tactic rewires the target's behavior. You become more agreeable, more careful. You avoid emotional honesty, not because it's wrong, but because silence has taught you that truth equals abandonment. And the worst part, you begin to call it love, because in a world where silence is a weapon, any reply starts to feel like mercy. Cognitive load flooding. Cognitive load flooding is a psychological assault on clarity, where the manipulator overwhelms the mind with too much information, emotion, or decision-making pressure all at once until the victim is mentally paralyzed. It's not about control through fear, it's control through confusion. By flooding the brain with rapid shifts, contradictions, urgent demands, and emotional spikes, the manipulator shuts down the victim's ability to think critically, forcing them to default to compliance just to relieve the pressure. This tactic often begins innocently, a conversation that spirals quickly, a sudden text filled with accusations, an urgent demand followed by shifting explanations. The victim is pulled in multiple directions: defend, explain, comfort, fix, decide, all at once. No moment to process, no time to respond with balance. The brain goes into overdrive, desperately trying to track the logic, regulate the emotion, and avoid further escalation. And that's exactly the point. When the cognitive system is overloaded, it begins to short-circuit. Rational thought is suspended. The victim starts agreeing just to make it stop. They apologize for things they didn't do. They promise to change things they don't understand. The manipulator creates chaos, then positions themselves as the only one who can end it. They destabilize, then soothe, confuse, then clarify on their own terms. Over time, the victim begins to doubt their own memory, their own reasoning, their own stability. They avoid confrontation altogether, not because they're wrong, but because they're exhausted. The manipulator doesn't need to win through logic. They win by turning clarity into a luxury the victim no longer has access to, because when a mind is flooded, it doesn't rebel. It drowns quietly and clings to the first hand that pretends to pull it up. The delay of comfort strategy. The delay of comfort strategy is a psychological manipulation that breaks a person's emotional rhythm by making them wait. Wait for reassurance, wait for kindness, wait for the comfort they were once freely given. It's not outright cruelty. It's deprivation dressed as indifference. The manipulator doesn't say, "I don't care." They say nothing at all, until the silence becomes loud enough to teach a lesson. And the lesson is always the same. Comfort is not your right. It's my reward to give or to withhold. This strategy begins in moments of distress. You cry, you reach out, you expose a vulnerable part of yourself, and instead of being met with warmth, you get a pause, an absence, a void. Hours pass, or days, and when they finally respond, it's brief, distracted, or conditional. The message is clear. Your emotions are inconvenient unless they serve the manipulator's timeline. That delay doesn't just hurt, it trains you. The brain begins to associate vulnerability with punishment, expression with silence, need with shame. This tactic weaponizes emotional hunger. When comfort is withheld long enough, even scraps feel like a feast. One kind word after days of distance floods your system with relief. You begin chasing that feeling, not realizing you've started bargaining with your pain. You become more careful about when and how you express emotion, tailoring your truth around what won't lead to delay. And little by little, the manipulator doesn't have to demand obedience. They've created a world where you anticipate abandonment and act in ways that prevent it. What makes the delay of comfort so dangerous is that it feels personal. Maybe I'm too needy. Maybe I expect too much. But it's not you. It's the design. Because when comfort is used as a tool of control, it stops being love and becomes a leash. Neurotic loop creation. Neurotic loop creation is a psychological method of inducing obsessive thought spirals, where a person becomes trapped in their own mind, replaying doubts, fears, and insecurities on an endless reel. It's not just about making someone anxious, it's about building a mental maze they can't escape from. The manipulator does this by planting seeds of uncertainty, then feeding them just enough attention, silence, or contradiction to make the victim dig deeper, ask more, and think themselves into submission. This loop doesn't begin with a scream, it starts with a pause, a delayed reply, a suspicious glance, a vague comment like, "I just wish you understood me more." That's the hook. Then comes the pull. The targets need to understand, to fix, to explain. They replay conversations, reread messages, analyze tone, question motives. Every attempt to find clarity only leads to more questions, no answers, just more loops. The manipulator knows exactly when to give and when to withhold, dripping attention, approval, or confusion at the right intervals to keep the mind spinning. They interrupt closure, they interrupt logic, and instead of resolution, they offer riddles. You should know what's wrong. I don't want to talk about it right now. You tell me what you think you did. Each phrase turns inward, making the victim question not just the relationship, but their very perception of reality. The brilliance of this tactic is that it requires no force. The victim becomes their own jailer, their own judge, their own jury. They stay up late, crafting the perfect response, replaying the same moment from 6 different angles. Meanwhile, the manipulator sleeps soundly, knowing they've created a mental cage that runs on autopilot. Because once a neurotic loop is formed, the mind becomes a storm, and peace, even for a moment, feels like something that must be earned. Manufactured chaos, stability. Manufactured chaos stability is one of the most insidious forms of psychological control because it makes instability feel like home. The manipulator doesn't want peace. They want predictable unpredictability, a world where you're constantly off balance, constantly guessing, and constantly seeking grounding from the very person who's shaking the floor. It's a setup where the chaos is not accidental. It's curated, engineered, fed in small doses to create dependency. And the twisted part? Over time, your nervous system adjusts. The storm becomes the new calm. This strategy begins with subtle disruptions, a canceled plan, a sudden mood shift, a warm text followed by cold silence. These aren't random. They're carefully timed to prevent you from building momentum, stability, or clarity. When things start to feel good, something changes. When peace starts to bloom, a problem appears. The manipulator keeps emotional equilibrium just out of reach, forcing you to work harder for connection, to become more accommodating, more forgiving, anything to restore the fleeting sense of calm they once gave. But the calm is never real. It's bait, a manufactured break in the tension to keep you hooked. The cycle becomes addictive. Chaos, relief, chaos again. Your body starts mistaking temporary stability for love. You breathe easier after a kind word, not because it's meaningful, but because you survived the turbulence to get it. That's how deep the hook goes. You don't crave joy. You crave the absence of harm. You don't want happiness. You just want the chaos to stop, and only they seem able to stop it. This method erases the ability to self-soothe, to trust your instincts, to know peace without panic. The manipulator becomes both the storm and the shelter, and you begin to believe that the only place you'll ever feel safe again is inside the chaos they create. Denial reinforcement training. Denial reinforcement training is a psychological tactic designed to erode a person's trust in their own perception by repeatedly invalidating their experiences until they begin to doubt not just what happened, but whether it happened at all. It's not gaslighting in a single moment. It's a sustained conditioning process where reality is slowly rewritten, memory by memory, feeling by feeling, until only the manipulator's version remains. It begins with subtle dismissal. A manipulator might say, "You're too sensitive," or "That's not what I meant," when confronted with hurtful behavior. At first, the victim pushes back, but over time, these denials stack. Every attempt to voice pain is met with minimization, deflection, or disbelief. The victim is told again and again that their feelings are wrong, their memory is flawed, their reaction is exaggerated. Eventually, they begin to pre-edit themselves, fearing the emotional punishment that comes from speaking their truth. The brilliance of this technique is in its repetition. Every small denial is like a crack in the foundation of reality. When someone hears that never happened enough times, the brain, desperate for stability, starts to agree. Not because it's true, but because it feels safer than the alternative. Constant conflict, emotional abandonment, or being labeled as crazy. The victim surrenders not because they believe the manipulator, but because they stop believing themselves. Soon, their entire emotional compass is broken. They apologize for being hurt. They explain away abuse. They even defend the very person who made them question their sanity. The manipulator doesn't need control over facts. They only need control over belief. And once the victim's inner truth is silenced, obedience follows, not out of fear, but from the hollow, devastating thought, "Maybe I really am the problem." Inconsistency exploitation. Inconsistency exploitation is a psychological manipulation that doesn't just confuse, it rewires. It's the deliberate use of mixed signals, emotional whiplash, and shifting behavior to destabilize someone's reality, making them easier to influence, control, and ultimately depend on the manipulator for emotional grounding. It's not the act of being inconsistent that makes it dangerous. It's the pattern being just stable enough to give hope and just chaotic enough to keep the target perpetually chasing clarity that never comes. The cycle begins with moments of extreme closeness, laughter, passion, vulnerability, comfort. The manipulator offers a taste of emotional safety, then snatches it away without warning. One day, they're warm and affectionate. The next, distant and cold. No explanation, no apology. The target searches for the trigger, assuming they must have done something wrong, and that's when the trap tightens, because the uncertainty creates obsession. The victim begins to study every word, every look, trying to decode the pattern, desperate to return to the connection that once felt so real. But the manipulator is always changing the rules. What worked yesterday backfires today. Praise turns to criticism without provocation. Loving gestures become weapons. It creates a psychological dependence where the victim no longer trusts their own judgment and instead calibrates their emotions to the manipulator's ever-shifting moods. Over time, inconsistency doesn't just exhaust, it conditions. The brain starts associating unpredictability with love, and the occasional good moment becomes the justification to stay, to forgive, to try harder. The danger lies in the illusion that the chaos is temporary, that if you just do things right, the good version of them will return. But inconsistency exploitation ensures that version only shows up when control is needed, just long enough to keep you hoping, doubting, and emotionally tethered to someone who never actually needed to change. Broken mirror identity games. Broken mirror identity games are a dark psychological strategy where a manipulator deliberately reflects back a distorted version of someone's identity, just enough to resemble truth, but warped enough to induce deep confusion, insecurity, and dependency. It's the art of making someone question who they are by subtly dismantling the reflection they once trusted. The manipulator doesn't tell outright lies. Instead, they hold up a mirror cracked in all the right places, so every time the victim looks at themselves, they see something flawed. It starts with small shifts. The manipulator exaggerates weaknesses while downplaying strengths. A confident decision is reframed as arrogance. A boundary is spun as selfishness. A compliment is followed by a backhanded remark. The victim begins to wonder if they're really kind, really stable, really lovable, or if they've just been fooling themselves all along. Their self-image begins to fracture, not from one attack, but from 1,000 tiny fractures in the glass. The real cruelty of this tactic is how personalized it is. The manipulator watches carefully, studying insecurities, past wounds, and secret hopes, and then uses them as tools of distortion. They mimic the victim's language, passions, even fears, and then twist them ever so slightly. The result is haunting. The victim sees parts of themselves reflected back, but never quite as they knew them. They feel exposed, yet unseen, familiar, yet alien. Over time, the victim no longer trusts their inner compass. They seek constant reassurance. They ask questions like, am I really like that? Was I too much? Do I make everything difficult? And every answer they get comes from the same broken mirror. The manipulator becomes the only person who seems to understand them because they're the one who designed the distorted reflection. And in chasing clarity, the victim falls deeper into a maze of misrecognition, forgetting not just what is true, but who they were before the mirror cracked. Reassurance. Reassurance withholding is a psychological tactic that turns emotional safety into a bargaining chip. It's the act of deliberately refusing to offer comfort, clarity, or affirmation in moments when someone needs it most, not out of forgetfulness, but as a quiet method of control. This isn't indifference, it's precision. The manipulator knows exactly when to offer reassurance and when to withhold it to create instability, self-doubt, and a growing dependence on their approval. It begins with subtle moments, a worried glance met with a blank stare, a trembling question brushed off with silence. You open up, and instead of comfort, you're met with deflection or distraction. Over time, these tiny denials compound. You stop feeling safe expressing your fears. You start editing your pain, and eventually, you no longer ask for reassurance. You beg for it, not because you're weak, but because they've trained your nervous system to believe that their response defines your reality. The tactic is especially potent because it's invisible. From the outside, the manipulator seems calm, logical, maybe even mature, but their calm is weaponized. Their emotional restraint becomes a mirror, reflecting back your neediness, your insecurity, your desperation. And so, you shrink. You apologize for needing answers. You question your emotions. You start to believe that needing comfort makes you a burden. This creates a dangerous power dynamic. The manipulator doesn't have to yell, blame, or overtly control. They simply go quiet when you're vulnerable. And that silence, strategically placed, makes you crave them more, not less. Reassurance withholding doesn't just create emotional starvation. It convinces you that the hunger is your fault and that only they hold the key to feeding it on a schedule only they control. Manufactured trust cycles. Manufactured trust cycles are one of the most seductive and sinister forms of psychological manipulation, where trust isn't earned naturally over time, but built rapidly, broken deliberately, and then rebuilt again, over and over to create emotional dependence. This cycle isn't about betrayal alone. It's about engineering highs and lows so extreme that the victim becomes addicted not to safety, but to the rebuilding of it. The manipulator doesn't need loyalty. They create it by making themselves the storm and the shelter. It begins with intense connection. The manipulator offers vulnerability, attention, validation, fast. It feels real, magnetic, like being seen for the first time. The target opens up, bonds, trusts. Then, without warning, something shifts. A cruel comment, sudden withdrawal, a sharp silence where there was once warmth. The bond cracks, and the target, confused and desperate, reaches to fix it, believing they did something wrong, that it's their job to make things right. That's when the manipulator returns, not with accountability, but with just enough affection or apology to restart the cycle. The relief is intoxicating. The pain is forgotten in the rush of reconnection. But what's really being taught is this: trust comes through chaos, and every time the manipulator breaks the bond and repairs it, they deepen their control. They're not just earning forgiveness, they're training the target to associate instability with intimacy. Over time, the victim stops resisting the roller coaster. They fear calm, expecting the next drop. They overextend, overapologize, overperform, anything to get back to the good version of the manipulator, the one who only appears after enough suffering. And the manipulator? They've turned trust into a game, a pattern, a tool, not to create closeness, but to make sure they're the only place the target ever turns to feel safe again. Strategic overapologizing. Strategic overapologizing is a disarming psychological tactic that hides control beneath the mask of humility. It looks like excessive politeness, like someone taking the blame for everything, even when it isn't their fault. But it's not weakness, it's strategy. By apologizing first, loudest, and most often, the manipulator creates an emotional imbalance where their guilt protects them from accountability and subtly pressures others to play the role of the comforter, not the accuser. At first, it seems harmless. They say sorry when they're late, when they forget, even when they hurt you. And at first, it feels like empathy. But something strange happens. You start comforting them. No, it's okay. I understand. You're the one in pain. But they've positioned themselves as the one feeling so bad about it that now your attention is on soothing them. The spotlight shifts, and with it, the emotional power. Over time, the apologies become emotional currency. Whenever tension arises, they collapse into exaggerated remorse, crying, self-blame, dramatic declarations like, "I'm such a terrible person." But the goal isn't growth, it's escape. Escape from reflection, from change, from you having a legitimate grievance. The moment you confront their behavior, they drown the conversation in sorrow, leaving you feeling guilty for even bringing it up. You pull back, you soften, you let them off the hook. And that's the trap. Strategic over-apologizing isn't about healing, it's about redirecting. It cloaks manipulation in vulnerability, silences rightful anger, and trains the victim to equate confrontation with cruelty. In the end, you stop speaking your truth, not because they scared you, but because they made it emotionally expensive to hold them accountable. Pain-driven empathy theft. Pain-driven empathy theft is a psychological tactic where someone uses their own suffering not to connect, but to control. It's the act of weaponizing pain, real or exaggerated, to hijack another person's compassion and use it as leverage. The manipulator doesn't beg for power. They evoke it by drowning the target in sorrow, so intense, so raw, that resistance starts to feel cruel. This isn't about seeking comfort. It's about exploiting the human instinct to care and turning that instinct into a leash. The manipulator reveals wounds in curated moments, often when they're being questioned, exposed, or at risk of losing influence. They might say, "You don't know what I've been through," or "No one ever cared when I cried before." The words drip with vulnerability, but behind them is strategy. It's not openness, it's redirection. Every ounce of sympathy pulled from the target is 1 ounce of accountability that slips away. The brilliance and horror of this tactic is that it rewires guilt. The victim begins to feel heartless for asserting needs or boundaries. The manipulator becomes emotionally untouchable, cloaked in tragedy. And because the pain often sounds real, sometimes it is real, the target doesn't realize they're being emotionally robbed. They just want to help. They want to heal the wound. But the wound never closes. It reopens, always at the most convenient moment for the manipulator. Over time, the victim becomes the caretaker, the fixer, the silent, emotional sponge. Their own pain shrinks in comparison. Their needs dissolve under the weight of someone else's sadness. They stop expressing discomfort, fearing they'll hurt someone already hurting. And the manipulator keeps feeding off that empathy, turning it into fuel, because the more someone gives, the less they have left to protect themselves. And that's exactly the point. Passive-aggressive scripting. Passive-aggressive scripting is a psychological strategy where a manipulator communicates hostility, control, or resentment without ever saying anything outright. Instead, they craft a narrative built on double meanings, subtle digs, and carefully disguised barbs designed to provoke discomfort while maintaining the illusion of innocence. It's not about confrontation, it's about confusion. The manipulator hides behind politeness, leaving the target to question their own sensitivity, unsure if what just happened was real or imagined. This tactic thrives in ambiguity. A backhanded compliment like, "Wow, you're actually on time today," or a veiled jab such as, "I wouldn't expect you to understand something like this," slips under the radar. It creates a tiny sting. But if the victim reacts, they're accused of overthinking, being dramatic, or having no sense of humor. The real message is never said directly, which gives the manipulator complete deniability. The hurt lands, but the hand that threw it stays clean. Over time, these messages accumulate. The victim begins to doubt their instincts. They hesitate before responding. They replay conversations in their head, searching for clarity that never comes. And in the process, they grow quieter, more compliant, more emotionally dependent. Because every time they try to call it out, the manipulator flips the script. "I was just joking," or "You're being too sensitive again." And the victim, unsure and emotionally fatigued, backs down. The genius of passive-aggressive scripting is that it punishes while pretending to be harmless. It isolates without ever raising a voice, and it conditions the target to tolerate subtle disrespect in the name of keeping the peace. But beneath the surface, a war is being waged, one where the weapon is suggestion, the battlefield is language, and the casualties are confidence, clarity, and emotional safety. Identity comparison warping is a psychological manipulation technique that reshapes how a person sees themselves by constantly forcing them to measure who they are against who they're not. It's not about uplifting or guiding. It's about creating an endless mirror of comparison that distorts confidence, fragments self-worth, and breeds quiet self-hatred. The manipulator doesn't insult directly. They offer examples, observations, and standards that always seem to highlight what the victim lacks. It often begins with subtle praise of others. "She always knows the right thing to say." "He never overreacts like some people do." "You should see how calm they are under pressure." These comments don't seem malicious at first. They might even sound thoughtful, but over time, they build a mental prison where the victim is always the one falling short. No matter how hard they try, someone else is always more intelligent, more attractive, more capable, more desirable. The manipulator doesn't have to criticize. Comparison does it for them. The cruelty is in its invisibility. The victim starts chasing perfection, not for growth, but to stop feeling less than. They change how they dress, how they speak, how they respond, but the bar keeps moving. The more they mold themselves, the more they're reminded who they still aren't. Their own identity becomes a project of correction, never satisfaction. Eventually, the victim stops trusting their instincts. They second-guess compliments, question their achievements, and begin to see themselves through the distorted lens of inferiority. The manipulator becomes the architect of this identity crisis, not by force, but by planting constant reminders of who the victim should be instead. And in trying to close the gap between self and ideal, the victim loses sight of the person they were before they started comparing. Idealization, devaluation, rejection. Idealization, devaluation, rejection is a brutal psychological cycle that traps the victim in an emotional pendulum swing, where they are first worshipped, then picked apart, and finally discarded as if they were never valued at all. It's not just manipulation, it's identity demolition. The manipulator doesn't just hurt someone, they build them up so high that the fall becomes disorienting, devastating, and unforgettable, and then they do it again. The cycle begins with idealization. The manipulator showers the target with admiration, attention, and praise. You're unlike anyone I've ever met. You understand me better than anyone. The intensity feels magical, fated. The victim lets their guard down. They start to believe they've found something rare, something real. Their sense of self inflates, not because of ego, but because of how beautifully they are being reflected back. But then comes the turn. Devaluation begins quietly. A snide comment, a disappointed sigh, a sudden lack of enthusiasm. Things that were once celebrated, intelligence, independence, sensitivity, are now framed as flaws. You overthink everything. You always need attention. The victim tries harder, hoping to win back the golden version of the relationship, but no matter what they do, the warmth keeps shrinking. Then comes rejection, cold, sudden, final. The person who once clung to every word now goes silent. The affection that once felt endless is abruptly gone. The victim is left confused, shattered, and obsessively replaying every moment to understand what went wrong. But the truth is, nothing went wrong. The cycle was designed to end this way. The rejection isn't a reaction, it's the conclusion. What makes this cycle so devastating is that it's psychological whiplash. The same person who made the victim feel like the center of the universe now treats them like they never mattered. And the deeper the initial idealization, the harder it is to believe the ending was real. So the victim stays emotionally tethered, hoping to be idealized again, not realizing they were never loved for who they were, only for the illusion they fulfilled. Implanted choice illusions. Implanted choice illusions are a psychological tactic where the manipulator gives the appearance of freedom, but only within options they have carefully pre-selected to serve their own agenda. It's not about forcing decisions, it's about making the victim feel like they're choosing, when in truth, every path has already been paved toward the same destination. The power lies not in overt control, but in engineered permission. The technique often shows up in relationships, workplaces, even parenting. A partner might say, "You can either come to the event with me or stay home alone. It's your call." The words imply freedom. The tone suggests consequence. The unspoken pressure says there's a right answer and you already know what it is. A boss might offer two deadlines, one impossibly fast, the other barely doable, but praise you more if you choose the harder one. A friend might ask for a favor while offering just enough guilt to make refusal feel like betrayal. What makes this tactic so effective is that the victim internalizes the illusion. They walk through the door thinking they opened it. They agree, comply, sacrifice, while believing they had control all along. The manipulator never had to demand. They simply box in the options so neatly that any choice the victim made would still benefit them. Over time, this reshapes autonomy itself. The victim becomes conditioned to weigh every decision not based on what they want, but on how to avoid disappointing, upsetting, or losing the manipulator. Eventually, The idea of saying no becomes unthinkable, not because of fear, but because the victim has forgotten what real choice feels like. And the manipulator? They never needed to take power. They just made sure the only doors that open were the ones they wanted you to walk through. Covert dependency triggers. Covert dependency triggers are hidden psychological mechanisms planted by manipulators to create silent, growing emotional reliance. Unlike overt control, this tactic operates beneath awareness, conditioning the target to need the manipulator without fully realizing it. It's not about dominance through intimidation. It's about shaping someone's emotional reflexes so subtly that over time, they can't imagine functioning without the very person who's pulling the strings. The manipulator starts by offering themselves as the solution to problems they subtly emphasize. They'll say, "I'm the only one who really gets you," or "No one else would put up with what you've been through." These statements seem caring, even intimate, but underneath, they're planting the seed, "You are difficult, and I am your lifeline." Over time, the manipulator becomes the source of reassurance, safety, approval, even decision-making. But it's a system they designed, and the dependence isn't natural, it's sculpted. The brilliance of covert triggers is how they're disguised as support. The manipulator might deliberately overwhelm the target with stress, then swoop in with comfort. They might sabotage the target's confidence, only to praise them when they're compliant. Gradually, the target learns to look to the manipulator for emotional regulation, validation, and direction. They lose the muscle memory for independence, and the manipulator tightens their grip, not by force, but by being necessary. Soon, the victim stops asking for advice from others, stops making moves without checking in, starts waiting for approval before trusting their own voice. And the manipulator? They've become the invisible center of someone's emotional world. The scariest part is that this dependency doesn't feel like imprisonment. It feels like love, loyalty, and trust, until one day, the victim wakes up and realizes they've handed over their entire sense of self, piece by piece, to someone who planned it that way from the start. Emotional paralysis. Emotional paralysis framing is a dark psychological technique where the manipulator traps someone in a constant state of internal contradiction, deliberately setting up emotional double binds that leave the victim frozen, unsure of how to act, speak, or even feel without risking punishment. It's not that the target is afraid of doing the wrong thing. It's that every option feels wrong. Every step forward threatens backlash. Every silence screams guilt. And eventually, the victim learns that doing nothing feels safer than doing anything at all. This framing is built through conflicting expectations. "Be honest with me," the manipulator says, but punishes honesty with withdrawal or anger. "Tell me what you need," they offer, but respond to vulnerability with criticism. The victim becomes emotionally paralyzed, stuck in a loop of anticipation and fear. Even joy becomes dangerous. A good day might trigger jealousy. Confidence might provoke contempt, so the victim shrinks, quiet, agreeable, anxious. The brilliance of this tactic lies in how it rewires emotional response. The victim starts second-guessing even basic instincts. Am I overreacting? Was I too cold? Did I make them feel unwanted? Feelings aren't expressed anymore. They're filtered through a lens of possible punishment. Emotions become calculations, not expressions, and the manipulator watches as the victim becomes smaller, less vocal, more dependent, conditioned to believe that the safest way to exist is to tiptoe through life and call it love. Over time, this framing turns vibrant people into shadows, not because they lack passion, but because they've been taught that any display of it might be used against them. The manipulator doesn't silence them with threats. They teach them to silence themselves, and eventually, they don't need control, because paralysis becomes the victim's default setting, and they forget what freedom ever felt like. Authority role. Hijacking, authority role hijacking, is a psychological power play where the manipulator assumes a position of unearned dominance, not through credentials or experience, but through behavior, tone, and subtle social engineering. They don't wait to be given authority. They act as if they already have it. And most people, conditioned to obey those who sound certain, simply follow. It's not about leadership. It's about dominance disguised as guidance. The manipulator doesn't rise through trust. They bypass it entirely by seizing the role and daring anyone to challenge them. It begins with confidence. The manipulator speaks first, speaks loudest, or speaks last. They correct others publicly, take credit quietly, and project the air of someone who knows best, even when they don't. They interrupt, they assert, they advise without being asked, and they question others in a way that makes disagreement feel risky. To the group, they start to feel like the authority, not because they're right, but because they make themselves untouchable. This tactic is especially potent in uncertain environments, new teams, social groups, emotionally charged situations where people are looking for guidance. The manipulator fills the vacuum with certainty. They might reference vague experience, drop names, or claim insight into how things really work, and most won't push back because social discomfort, fear of conflict, or self-doubt will keep others silent. Over time, the manipulator's dominance becomes normalized. Others defer to them, consult them, fear disappointing them, and if someone finally challenges the hijacked authority, they're framed as disrespectful, insubordinate, or emotionally unstable. The manipulator doesn't need to prove their role anymore. They've built a reality where everyone else confirms it for them. The terrifying truth? In group dynamics, people don't always follow the most qualified voice. They follow the most confident one. And when confidence is counterfeit, control is quietly stolen, while the group mistakes it for leadership. Thought loop confusion techniques. Thought loop confusion techniques are psychological traps designed to overwhelm clarity by circling logic back onto itself, until the victim is stuck in a mental loop with no clear exit. It's not just confusion, it's engineered disorientation, where every question leads to another question, every answer contradicts itself, and every attempt at resolution tightens the knot. The goal isn't to win an argument, it's to make the victim doubt whether logic even applies anymore. This tactic begins with contradictory statements. The manipulator might say, "You're too emotional to understand," and then later accuse the victim of being cold and detached. They'll claim, "You always want control," but then blame them for not taking responsibility. Each statement conflicts with the last, but is delivered with such conviction that the victim begins to search for consistency that was never meant to exist. The real damage lies in what happens internally. The victim starts analyzing every conversation like a puzzle they should be able to solve. They replay words, rethink tones, interpret silence, but the deeper they dig, the more tangled it becomes, because the loop isn't designed to be broken. It's designed to replace clarity with exhaustion. The manipulator, meanwhile, stays calm, insisting that they are the reasonable one, that they are simply reacting to the victim's instability. This reversal sharpens the trap. Now the victim not only feels confused, but ashamed for being confused. They begin apologizing just to end the spiral, believing that their inability to make sense of things proves the manipulator must be right. Over time, this confusion becomes the norm. Decisions feel impossible, boundaries feel blurred, and thought itself becomes suspect. The victim no longer trusts their mind, not because it failed, but because it was twisted into a labyrinth designed to have no door, only circles, only doubt, only silence. Predictable chaos projection. Predictable chaos projection is a psychological technique where a manipulator creates a cycle of emotional instability that feels spontaneous but is carefully timed to establish control. The chaos isn't random, it only appears that way. In truth, It's a calculated pattern of outbursts, silence, drama, or confusion used to keep others on edge, constantly adapting, constantly anticipating the next storm. The goal is not just to destabilize, it's to make the victim expect to be destabilized until their entire behavior is shaped by the fear of disruption. At first, the chaos seems like mood swings. One day, warmth. The next, cold. A loving message followed by an accusation. A peaceful dinner shattered by a sudden withdrawal. But over time, the victim begins to recognize a rhythm. Not because the manipulator changes, but because their own nervous system starts to adapt. They plan around it. They censor themselves. They tiptoe, over-apologize, and overcorrect. Their life becomes an anxious game of prediction, always wondering what version of the manipulator will show up next. The trick lies in the projection. The manipulator blames others for the chaos they cause. You always upset me. You're impossible to please. Suddenly, the victim isn't just surviving emotional upheaval. They're being told it's their fault. So they try harder. So they get quieter. And the manipulator stays in control, not by force, but by creating an environment so emotionally volatile that the only constant is submission. Over time, the chaos becomes normal. The silence before an outburst becomes its own kind of terror. The victim no longer waits for peace. They wait for the next break. And the manipulator? They never have to demand compliance. They've made fear do the asking. Polarity induction games are a psychological manipulation technique that forces people into extreme emotional positions by deliberately triggering opposite reactions, then exploiting the imbalance. The manipulator doesn't ask for agreement or support. They provoke an emotional seesaw where the victim is pushed from one pole to another, love to hate, guilt to rage, security to fear, until their sense of internal balance shatters. Once that emotional center is gone, the manipulator controls the swing. This tactic thrives on emotional provocation. The manipulator might first idealize the victim. You're the only person who really understands me. Then, without warning, they flip the script. I don't think you care about me at all. This sudden shift forces the victim to scramble emotionally, desperate to restore what was just taken. It's not just whiplash, it's emotional conditioning. The brain, desperate for the return of warmth, begins overcompensating, giving more, apologizing faster, silencing objections just to bring back the version of the manipulator who once adored them. Over time, the victim becomes hyper-attuned to the manipulator's moods, anticipating their swings, adjusting their own emotions to match. If the manipulator is cold, the victim burns hotter to keep the connection alive. If the manipulator is cruel, the victim becomes more forgiving, believing that softness might bring them back. The polarity becomes the prison, and the manipulator becomes the only one who can reset the balance. This game dismantles emotional neutrality. It erodes the ability to feel steadily, to think calmly, to choose rationally. Everything becomes a reaction to extreme emotional weather. The victim doesn't just lose peace, they lose perspective, trapped in a rhythm of highs and lows orchestrated by someone who pulls the strings, not through reason, but through violent contrasts. Not because they want connection, but because they crave control disguised as chaos. Negative empathy framing. Negative empathy framing is a psychological technique where empathy is twisted into a weapon, used not to connect, but to control. The manipulator pretends to understand the victim's feelings deeply, only to use that understanding against them. It's not cruelty through distance, it's cruelty through closeness. The tactic relies on gaining access to someone's emotional world, mirroring their pain, then subtly reframing it to serve the manipulator's narrative. It feels like compassion, but it corrupts the very thing it mimics. It starts with phrases like, "I know exactly how you feel," or, "If I were you, I'd be hurt too." The manipulator validates just enough to earn trust. The victim opens up, thinking they found a safe space. They reveal insecurities, trauma, desires, and then the twist begins. But maybe you're overthinking it. People have it worse. You're too emotional sometimes. What started as understanding becomes soft invalidation, cloaked in concern. This inversion creates deep confusion. The victim feels heard, but not supported, seen, but not believed. And because the manipulator seems empathic, the victim begins to question their own emotions instead of the person twisting them. They internalize blame. They adjust their behavior. They shrink themselves to seem less fragile. The manipulator stays clean because they never deny the pain outright. They just suggest gently that maybe the pain is too much. Over time, this reframing erodes the victim's trust in their own emotional reality. They become easier to control because they stop advocating for themselves. They seek constant reassurance. They doubt their instincts. And the manipulator, they maintain control not by withholding empathy, but by distorting it, because nothing disarms a person faster than believing someone understands their pain, only to find out that understanding was never meant to heal. It was meant to rewrite. Reward, inconsistency, conditioning. Reward, inconsistency, conditioning is a powerful and deeply disorienting psychological tactic where the manipulator deliberately gives unpredictable responses to someone's behavior, offering praise, love, or attention at random intervals rather than through consistency. It creates a state of emotional gambling where the victim keeps trying, keeps giving, keeps hoping, because sometimes they get what they crave, but they never know when or why or how long it will last. And that's exactly what makes it so addictive. The manipulator doesn't need to be cruel all the time. In fact, they aren't. That's the hook. They oscillate between warmth and coldness, validation and silence, affection and detachment. One day, a kind word for doing the dishes. The next, indifference for the same effort. One week, love bombing for a small gesture. The next, punishment for the same act. The message is never clear, but the effect is undeniable. The victim becomes obsessed with trying to figure out the formula that unlocks reward. This pattern hijacks the brain's dopamine system, the same one activated in slot machines and toxic relationships. The uncertainty becomes intoxicating. The victim keeps returning, adjusting, sacrificing more of themselves, not because they feel valued, but because they're chasing the chance of being valued. It's not the reward that enslaves. It's the unpredictability. Over time, this conditioning reshapes behavior entirely. The victim stops expecting fairness. They learn to tolerate pain. They tell themselves, it's better when it's good, or maybe this time will be different. But it never is. The manipulator controls the switch, the timing, the dosage, and in a world where emotional rewards are doled out like rare prizes, the victim stops asking whether the relationship is healthy because they're too busy chasing the next hit of hope. Rejection Desensitization. Rejection desensitization is a psychological conditioning technique where the manipulator gradually numbs the victim to being dismissed, ignored, or devalued until rejection no longer shocks. It just quietly controls. It doesn't start with cruelty. It starts with distance. A late reply here, a canceled plan there, a cold look in a moment that should have felt warm. Slowly, rejection becomes a recurring experience until the target no longer protests. They expect it, and that expectation changes everything. At first, the victim tries to resist. They ask questions, they reach out, they express hurt, but the manipulator remains indifferent, offering silence, deflection, or guilt-inducing responses like "you're too needy" or "I can't always drop everything for you." These micro-rejections aren't just tolerated, they're normalized. The more they happen, the more the victim adapts, shrinking their expectations to avoid further disappointment. They stop asking for support, they stop expressing needs, they lower their voice emotionally and literally just to preserve the connection. The brilliance of this tactic is that it doesn't feel like abuse. it feels like a slow erosion. And because the rejection isn't dramatic, the victim doesn't recognize how much they're losing. They just start adjusting, reinterpreting neglect as strength, emotional hunger as independence. But inside, something quiet begins to die, the belief that they deserve consistency, attention, care. Over time, the manipulator doesn't even need to say no anymore. The victim stops requesting. They don't pull away, not because they're attached, but because they've been trained to settle for less, trained to feel grateful for breadcrumbs, trained to stay close to someone who keeps pushing them away. And that's the final trick. When someone becomes so used to rejection that they start rejecting themselves before anyone else gets the chance. Strategic absence patterning. Strategic absence patterning is a calculated psychological manipulation where the manipulator disappears physically, emotionally, or communicatively at precisely chosen times, not to detach, but to create a void that heightens their perceived value. It's not just vanishing, it's withdrawing with purpose. The silence isn't distance, it's a performance. And the target, left in confusion and longing, begins to interpret the absence as significance, craving the return of the person who engineered the emptiness. At first, it feels like space, a missed call, a late reply, a canceled meeting. But over time, the pattern emerges. The absence always occurs when the target gains a sense of power, clarity, or independence. Right after a boundary is asserted, right after the victim starts asking hard questions, the manipulator retreats, not as punishment, but as a pressure valve. Their disappearance becomes a message. Without me, look how empty everything feels. When they return, it's rarely with apology. Often it's with charm, distraction, or just enough warmth to reignite the bond. And the victim, having felt the ache of disconnection, becomes even more attached, mistaking the manipulator's absence for proof of emotional depth. In reality, it's a script, a rhythm, a manipulation of emotional gravity. The less frequent the presence, the more valuable it seems. Over time, the victim internalizes the cycle. They stop questioning the disappearances, they romanticize the reappearances, and they begin adjusting themselves, not to stay close, but to avoid being left again. Strategic absence doesn't just hurt, it conditions. It teaches the victim to fill in the emotional gaps with longing, apology, and self-blame. Meanwhile, the manipulator controls the tempo of connection like a conductor, knowing the music sounds sweeter when it returns after silence. Emotional withholding as currency. Emotional withholding as currency is a manipulation technique where affection, attention, and emotional availability are no longer given freely. They're used as bargaining chips. Love becomes a transaction, warmth becomes leverage, and connection becomes a reward only granted when the victim behaves in a way the manipulator approves of. It's not about emotional detachment. It's about calculated scarcity, creating need, then controlling how and when that need is met. In the beginning, the manipulator may seem deeply engaged, generous with compliments, affection, reassurance, but slowly that supply tightens. A loving gesture is withdrawn after a disagreement. Eye contact disappears after a boundary is set. A once affectionate partner turns cold and distant without explanation. The victim, desperate to get the warmth back, begins to alter themselves. They apologize faster. They avoid conflict. They say yes when they mean no, not because they want to, but because they miss the feeling of being emotionally held. The brilliance of this tactic lies in its invisibility. The manipulator doesn't need to argue. They simply vanish emotionally. No touch, no kindness, no presence. And when the victim bends just enough, the affection returns. It's a reward system built on inconsistency. The victim starts working harder, not to feel loved, but to avoid the pain of emotional exile. Over time, the manipulator becomes the sole supplier of relief. All affection feels earned. All connection feels conditional. Eventually, the victim stops noticing how unfair the system is. They focus instead on staying in emotional favor, afraid to rock the boat or ask for more. The manipulator doesn't have to use threats. They use silence. Not absence of presence, but absence of emotion. Because in this game, the real power isn't in giving love, it's in deciding when it gets taken away. Intrusive curiosity traps. Intrusive curiosity traps are subtle psychological snares where the manipulator asks deeply personal, probing questions under the guise of interest or intimacy, not to connect, but to gain power through knowledge. It's not curiosity in its innocent form. It's weaponized attention. The manipulator doesn't want to know the target. They want to own the target's secrets, weaknesses, and unspoken fears, and they do this by getting others to open up too fast, too deep, too soon. It starts with charm, warm eyes, soft tones, a question that feels thoughtful. What's something you've never told anyone? The victim feels seen, even special, and so they share. They confess old wounds, hidden guilt, dreams they've never voiced out loud. It feels freeing, but the trap isn't the question, it's what happens after. The manipulator stores the answers. They memorize them, not for closeness, but for leverage. Later, in conflict, those very secrets are twisted. A moment of vulnerability is used as evidence of instability. A childhood story becomes a punchline. A fear becomes a button that's pressed with surgical precision. The victim, shocked, starts to close up, but the damage is done. The manipulator now holds pieces of their identity. The victim begins to second-guess how much they revealed, feeling exposed, unsafe, and ashamed. What makes this tactic so destructive is that it feels like connection at first. Victims often don't realize what's happening until the information is weaponized, and even then, part of them wonders if it's their fault for oversharing. But it wasn't. The conversation wasn't equal. The trust wasn't mutual. It was a one-sided excavation, disguised as depth, designed to strip someone bare, then hold the mirror up when it hurts the most. Intermittent gaslighting. Intermittent gaslighting is a manipulative technique where falsehoods, denial, and distortion are delivered sporadically and unpredictably, creating a roller coaster of doubt that keeps the victim off balance and constantly questioning reality. Unlike continuous gaslighting, which is relentless, intermittent gaslighting is calculated in its timing. The manipulator mixes truth with deception, kindness with cruelty, clarity with confusion, making it nearly impossible for the victim to trust their own memory or judgment. This unpredictability hooks the mind. One moment, the manipulator validates feelings and acknowledges reality. The next, they deny events happened, twist facts, or blame the victim for misunderstandings. This erratic pattern causes cognitive dissonance. The victim desperately tries to reconcile conflicting information, searching for consistency that never arrives. The confusion becomes exhausting, making the victim more reliant on the manipulator to clarify what is real. Intermittent gaslighting also strengthens the manipulator's control by fostering dependency. The victim hesitates to confront or challenge, fearing they might be wrong, or that pushing too hard will bring back the cruelty. They become hyper-vigilant, constantly self-editing and doubting themselves in hopes of maintaining peace. Over time, their sense of self erodes, replaced by a fragile identity shaped by the manipulator's shifting narratives. Because of its on-again, off-again nature, intermittent gaslighting is especially insidious. It's like emotional whiplash. Every moment of false clarity, followed by confusion, deepens the victim's entrapment. They cling to rare moments of truth as lifelines, unaware those moments are carefully handed out to keep the real control firmly in the manipulator's hands. Trust, inflation, and collapse. Trust, inflation, and collapse is a psychological manipulation strategy where a manipulator rapidly inflates trust and intimacy to create a false sense of security, only to shatter it suddenly, leaving the victim disoriented, vulnerable, and desperate to rebuild what was lost. This emotional roller coaster isn't accidental. It's engineered to make the victim cling tighter, mistaking chaos for passion and instability for authenticity. The process begins with overwhelming warmth, openness, and connection. The manipulator shares secrets, expresses affection, and makes grand promises, creating a flood of trust that sweeps the victim off their feet. The target feels uniquely seen and valued, often for the first time. This intense trust feels intoxicating. It breaks down walls and blurs boundaries. The victim begins to believe the manipulator is unlike anyone else. But then, just as quickly, the manipulator withdraws. Coldness replaces warmth. Promises go unkept. Conversations end abruptly. The victim is left grasping for reasons, questioning their own worth and judgment. The sudden collapse feels like a betrayal, but it also ignites a desperate hope for repair, a hope the manipulator uses to tighten their grip. This cycle repeats, each inflation making the collapse more devastating, each collapse making the inflation more necessary. Over time, the victim's emotional landscape becomes a pendulum swinging between elation and despair. The manipulator controls the rhythm, dictating when the victim feels safe and when they feel lost. In this dynamic, trust is not a foundation, it's a weapon, a fluctuating currency manipulated to keep the victim off balance, dependent, and constantly seeking to reclaim the fleeting moments of connection, never realizing that those moments were always part of the manipulation. Cold empathy testing. Cold empathy testing is a subtle, yet chilling psychological tactic where a manipulator gauges the emotional limits of their target by deliberately withholding warmth, understanding, or compassion, measuring how much emotional coldness the victim can endure before they break, comply, or seek approval. It's not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It's calculated detachment designed to test loyalty, patience, and control boundaries without overt confrontation. The manipulator's silence, indifference, or minimal response becomes a tool. They may respond with clipped answers, delayed replies, or neutral tones in moments when empathy would be expected. Instead of comforting, they observe. Instead of reassuring, they withhold. They watch how the victim reacts, whether they chase validation, apologize excessively, or quiet themselves to avoid further coldness. Each response is data. Each concession is a new line drawn. This testing erodes confidence. The victim begins to believe they're responsible for the emotional distance, wondering if they've done something wrong or if their feelings are too much. They become hyper-aware, constantly monitoring their behavior to avoid triggering more coldness. In this dynamic, empathy isn't given freely. It's earned through submission and sacrifice. The danger lies in how this technique rewires emotional responses. The victim starts associating love or attention with endurance and silent suffering. They learn to tolerate neglect as proof of worthiness. And the manipulator? They maintain power without saying a word, controlling not through force, but through the absence of feeling. The coldness becomes a test, and failure means losing connection, approval, or love. And so the victim stays trapped, frozen in a cycle of seeking warmth from a source that measures love by how much it can withhold. Denial of closure conditioning. Denial of closure conditioning is a psychological manipulation technique where the manipulator deliberately keeps conflicts, questions, or emotional wounds unresolved, trapping the victim in a state of perpetual uncertainty and emotional limbo. It's not just about leaving problems open-ended. It's about making the victim depend on the manipulator for answers that never come, forcing them to replay the same unresolved scenarios over and over in their mind. This tactic often begins with vague promises of explanation or change. We'll talk about this later, or you'll understand eventually. But later never arrives. The manipulator sidesteps, changes the subject, or offers cryptic responses that only deepen confusion. The victim is left suspended, haunted by what could be said, what might have happened, or what they might have misunderstood. The lack of closure becomes a weight, anchoring their thoughts and emotions to the relationship long after the interaction ends. The psychological toll is immense. Without resolution, the brain craves answers but receives none, creating a loop of rumination and doubt. The victim questions their memory, their feelings, their sanity, constantly searching for meaning in the silence. They hold on to hope for reconciliation or explanation, making them vulnerable to further manipulation. This conditioning also reinforces the manipulator's control. By denying closure, they ensure the victim remains emotionally tethered and uncertain, less likely to move on or set firm boundaries. The victim's energy is spent chasing clarity, while the manipulator remains distant and elusive. Over time, the denial of closure rewires emotional responses. The victim's normal instinct to seek resolution becomes tangled with anxiety and dependence, turning the absence of answers into a powerful tool of control. The manipulator doesn't just avoid closure, they weaponize it, keeping the victim trapped in an endless loop of emotional suspense. Future fake affection. Future fake affection is a psychological manipulation where promises of love, care, and commitment are dangled endlessly, but never truly delivered in the present. The manipulator uses visions of a perfect future, a future filled with warmth, attention, and security, to keep the victim emotionally hooked, even as the present reality remains cold, distant, or neglectful. It's not about genuine connection now. It's about selling hope that tomorrow will be different, while today's pain is quietly ignored. This tactic often begins with grand declarations. When things settle down, I'll be there for you. Once I'm done with this, we'll have all the time in the world. The victim hears these words and clings to them, replaying the hopeful future like a lifeline. They tolerate neglect, excuses, and emotional absence because they believe in what's promised. The manipulator doesn't have to show up now. They only have to keep promising to show up later. The cruelty of future fake affection is how it erodes the victim's sense of presence and self-worth. They start discounting their current needs, putting their emotional pain on hold. Every unmet promise becomes a silent debt the victim pays with their patience and loyalty. Over time, the future grows farther away, more vague, and less likely. But the victim feels trapped, afraid to let go because doing so means giving up the only version of love they've been allowed to see. The manipulator uses the future as a tool, never the present as a gift. And in this way, affection is always out of reach, forever just beyond grasp. The victim lives in a suspended state, caught between hope and neglect, waiting for a love that exists only in words, never in touch. Shame infusion techniques. Shame infusion techniques are psychological weapons that inject feelings of worthlessness and inadequacy into a person's sense of self, often so subtly that the victim doesn't realize they're being poisoned until the damage is deep. The manipulator doesn't have to shout or belittle outright. Instead, they weave shame into conversations, decisions, and even silences, making the target question their value, their choices, and ultimately their right to happiness or respect. This tactic operates through indirect comments like, "Maybe if you weren't so sensitive," or "I just don't understand why you can't be more like." It uses comparisons, sighs, or even raised eyebrows to communicate disappointment. The victim begins to internalize these signals, rewriting their internal dialogue into a constant narrative of self-doubt and self-criticism. What once might have been confidence erodes under the weight of imagined flaws. Shame infusion works because it exploits one of the most primal human needs, to belong and be accepted. When the manipulator makes the victim feel they're inherently flawed or defective, it fractures their sense of belonging. The victim then tries harder to fix themselves, often chasing impossible standards set silently by the manipulator. Over time, this method doesn't just affect behavior, it seeps into identity. The victim's self-worth becomes tied to the manipulator's approval, and any perceived failure triggers deep shame that can spiral into anxiety, depression, or withdrawal. The manipulator rarely needs to openly attack. They just need to drip shame consistently, turning love into condition, kindness into judgment, and acceptance into a prize, forever out of reach. Love bombing, then starving. Love bombing, then starving is a powerful psychological manipulation where overwhelming affection, attention, and praise are suddenly switched off, leaving the victim craving connection and desperate for approval. The manipulator floods the victim with intense love and validation, messages, gifts, compliments, promises, creating a high of emotional dependency. But once that dependency forms, the affection is abruptly withdrawn or withheld, plunging the victim into confusion, doubt, and longing. This tactic exploits the brain's craving for reward. The initial love bomb triggers a surge of dopamine and oxytocin, making the victim feel euphoric and bonded. They start to associate the manipulator with safety, acceptance, and happiness. But the withdrawal that follows is like an emotional famine. The sudden absence of warmth creates anxiety, insecurity, and a desperate need to regain the lost affection. The victim often blames themselves, wondering what they did wrong to deserve the coldness. The cycle then repeats. The manipulator returns with another burst of love, reigniting hope and dependency, only to pull back again. Each oscillation deepens the victim's emotional entrapment. They learn to tolerate mistreatment, confusion, and inconsistency because the brief returns of affection make the pain feel worth it. Over time, love bombing, then starving rewires the victim's emotional responses. They become addicted not to the love itself, but to the cycle, the highs and lows that control their sense of worth and connection. The manipulator doesn't need to maintain constant affection. They only need to give enough to keep the victim tethered, chasing a love that appears and disappears like a cruel mirage. The cracked mirror effect. The cracked mirror effect is a psychological manipulation where a person's self-image is fragmented and distorted through repeated subtle attacks and contradictions, leaving them confused about who they really are. It's not about outright insults or harsh criticism. Instead, it's about reflecting back a fractured, incomplete version of the victim's identity, so that every time they look inward, they see shards of doubt, guilt, and insecurity instead of a clear reflection. This effect starts with small, ambiguous comments. "I don't know if you really meant that," or "sometimes you seem different from who I thought you were." The victim begins to question their own feelings, memories, and intentions. Over time, the mirror they rely on to understand themselves becomes unreliable. Their sense of self splinters between what they believe, what others tell them, and what the manipulator projects. The cracked mirror effect thrives on contradiction and inconsistency. The manipulator might praise and then belittle, affirm and then deny, create closeness and then withdraw, all in ways that keep the victim off balance. This constant shifting breaks down emotional stability and erodes confidence, making the victim dependent on the manipulator's fragmented reflections to piece together their identity. As the cracks deepen, the victim struggles to trust their own perception. They look for validation outside themselves, often turning to the very person who shattered their self-image. This dependence becomes a trap. The cracked mirror effect doesn't just damage self-esteem, it rewires reality, making the victim a prisoner of a distorted reflection that only the manipulator controls. Moral guilt exploitation. Moral guilt exploitation is a psychological tactic where a manipulator weaponizes a person's sense of right and wrong to control, shame, or silence them. Instead of overt threats or anger, this technique wraps coercion in the language of morality, making the victim feel obligated, selfish, or unethical for asserting boundaries, making choices, or expressing dissent. It's not about fairness. It's about guilt dressed as virtue. The manipulator frames their desires or demands as moral imperatives. They might say things like, "If you really cared, you'd do this," or "Only a bad friend would say no now." These statements twist the victim's values, turning kindness into duty, patience into sacrifice, and compliance into proof of goodness. The victim is left torn between their own needs and the fear of being a bad or immoral person. This exploitation is powerful because guilt is a deeply ingrained social emotion. We learn early that guilt keeps communities functioning, but when guilt is manipulated, it becomes a trap. The victim begins to prioritize the manipulator's feelings and expectations over their own well-being. They overextend themselves, avoid conflict, and suppress discomfort, all to avoid the unbearable weight of moral failure. Over time, moral guilt exploitation rewires self-perception. The victim doubts their own ethics, second-guesses their decisions, and stays silent in the face of abuse. The manipulator doesn't need to yell or threaten. They just need to whisper that good people don't, and watch as control slips silently into their hands, disguised as concern, love, or righteousness. Learned powerlessness. Priming. Learned powerlessness, priming, is a psychological tactic that subtly conditions a person to feel incapable of influencing their own life, decisions, or emotions, teaching them over time that resistance is futile. It's not about outright domination or force. It's about creating a quiet, persistent sense of defeat, so the victim gradually surrenders control without realizing it's been taken. The manipulator doesn't have to break their spirit in a single blow. They prime it piece by piece until helplessness becomes automatic. This priming begins with small failures and dismissals. The manipulator might repeatedly override decisions, ignore preferences, or dismiss opinions with, "It's easier if I just handle this." When the victim tries to assert themselves, they're met with frustration, ridicule, or cold indifference. Over time, these responses teach the brain that effort leads to pain or rejection, while submission brings peace, however fragile. The power of this tactic lies in repetition and subtlety. The victim doesn't feel overtly controlled. They feel like they're just bad at standing up for themselves. Each small instance reinforces a narrative. Nothing I do changes anything. I'm not worth fighting for. The sense of agency shrinks until it's nearly invisible, buried beneath learned helplessness. This priming rewires motivation and expectation. The victim stops trying to change their circumstances, not because they lack desire, but because they've been taught that trying is pointless. The manipulator gains quiet control, not by force, but by shaping the very belief system that drives action. And the victim, caught in this cycle, often blames themselves, never realizing they've been primed to give up long before the fight began. Reputational sabotage layering. Reputational sabotage layering is a covert psychological tactic where a manipulator systematically undermines someone's credibility through a series of subtle, cumulative attacks, each seemingly insignificant on its own, but together creating a powerful narrative that damages reputation and isolates the victim. It's not a single blow. It's a slow, strategic erosion designed to make others doubt the victim's character, motives, and worth without ever confronting them openly. This technique often starts with whispers, casual remarks that plant seeds of suspicion, a joke disguised as concern, a friendly question about reliability, or a vague comment about trustworthiness. These small insinuations are layered over time by carefully timed gossip, selective omissions, and twisted truths. The manipulator never outright lies, but shapes perceptions by emphasizing flaws, mistakes, or misunderstandings repeatedly, ensuring that doubt becomes the default response when others think of the victim. The power of this layered sabotage lies in its subtlety. Because each piece seems minor, people don't recognize the pattern until the damage is done. The victim's voice becomes drowned out by a growing chorus of skepticism. They face exclusion from social groups, professional opportunities, or support networks, not because of any one event, but because their entire persona has been gradually reframed. Over time, the victim begins to internalize the narrative, questioning their own value and worth. Trust in others erodes, and isolation deepens. Meanwhile, the manipulator gains social power without ever needing direct confrontation. They've weaponized perception itself, turning the truth into a weapon by fragmenting it, layering it, and watching as the victim's reputation crumbles quietly, piece by piece. Mocked emotional disclosure. Mocked emotional disclosure is a cruel psychological tactic where genuine expressions of vulnerability are met with ridicule, sarcasm, or dismissal, tearing down trust and teaching the victim that sharing feelings is dangerous or pointless. It's not just a lack of support, it's active invalidation. When someone opens their heart, hoping for understanding or comfort, the manipulator twists it into a joke, a weakness, or a reason to distance themselves. This tactic often starts subtly, a smirk when tears appear, a sarcastic comment like, "Here we go again," or an eye roll in response to heartfelt words. The victim feels exposed and immediately regrets opening up, associating honesty with humiliation. Over time, they learn to hide their emotions, bury their pain, and mask their true selves, because every disclosure risks becoming a target for mockery. The manipulator gains power by controlling not just what's said, but what's allowed to be felt or expressed. They set the emotional rules, punishing authenticity and rewarding silence. Vulnerability becomes a trap, a sign of weakness rather than strength. The victim's emotional landscape shrinks, self-censorship becomes second nature, and the connection that should foster trust instead breeds fear. This dynamic fractures relationships and self-esteem alike. The victim begins to doubt their own feelings, questioning if they're too much or too sensitive. They may retreat entirely or only reveal superficial emotions to avoid the sting of ridicule. Meanwhile, the manipulator maintains control by making the emotional world unsafe, where true openness is mocked and survival means wearing a mask. Predictive behavior exploitation. Predictive behavior exploitation is a psychological tactic where a manipulator studies and anticipates another person's patterns, reactions, and decisions to preemptively control or influence their behavior. Instead of reacting to actions as they happen, the manipulator predicts responses and uses this foresight to set traps, guide choices, or manipulate outcomes before the victim even realizes they're being influenced. It's not reactive control, it's proactive domination. This technique begins with careful observation. The manipulator watches how the target responds under stress, what triggers anger or guilt, how they seek approval or avoid conflict. They learn habits, vulnerabilities, and boundaries, not to respect them, but to exploit them. For example, knowing that someone softens after criticism, the manipulator might deliver blame just before an important event, ensuring compliance. Or, understanding that the target avoids confrontation, they might pile demands, knowing resistance is unlikely. The brilliance of predictive behavior exploitation is that it feels inevitable to the victim. When they realize they're cornered or manipulated, they believe it's because of their own choices, not because someone anticipated and orchestrated those choices. This fosters self-doubt and confusion. The victim questions their autonomy, wondering if they ever had control at all. Over time, the manipulator gains increasing power, not by overt force, but by shaping the environment and expectations to their advantage. The victim becomes a puppet dancing to a choreography they never saw rehearsed. This exploitation wears down resistance before it even begins, making manipulation feel less like coercion and more like fate, when in reality, it's a cold, calculated strategy to own another person's will before they even realize it's been taken. Triangulation-Based Control. Triangulation-Based Control is a manipulative strategy where the manipulator inserts a third party into conflicts or relationships to create jealousy, competition, or insecurity, using that tension to maintain power and divert accountability. It's not just about drama, it's about controlling emotional dynamics by keeping people off balance and dependent on the manipulator's influence. The tactic often begins by sharing selective information with one person about another. I heard they're upset with you, or they don't think you're doing enough. The manipulator might play favorites, pit allies against each other, or leak private conversations, fostering mistrust and confusion. Each side becomes desperate for approval, constantly seeking to regain favor or prove loyalty, while the manipulator watches from the center, untouched and empowered. Triangulation works because humans naturally seek harmony and inclusion. When placed in the middle of conflict, people focus on repairing relationships rather than addressing the manipulator's behavior. The victim's energy is wasted navigating emotional minefields, while the manipulator avoids direct confrontation and responsibility. They become the indispensable arbiter, the source of information, validation, and connection. Over time, triangulation fractures genuine bonds. Allies become rivals, friends become suspicious, communication breaks down. The victim feels isolated and uncertain, never sure who is truthful or where they stand. The manipulator thrives in this chaos, their control solidified by confusion and divided loyalty. In essence, triangulation isn't just about creating conflict. It's about weaponizing connection itself, turning relationships into tools of control and keeping everyone so distracted by the drama that they never see who's really pulling the strings. Paranoia induction tactic. Paranoia induction tactics are psychological strategies designed to seed doubt, fear, and mistrust in a person's mind, making them question the loyalty, intentions, or honesty of those around them. The manipulator doesn't need to present facts. They simply suggest, imply, or hint at betrayals and conspiracies, turning the victim's own thoughts and perceptions into a spiraling web of suspicion. Over time, the victim's reality fractures, isolating them emotionally and socially. This technique often starts subtly. A manipulator might drop vague comments like, "I'm not sure everyone here has your best interests at heart," or "You wouldn't believe what I heard about so-and-so." These hints trigger the victim's fear of abandonment or betrayal. Their mind begins to search for proof, reinterpreting innocent actions as threats, casual conversations as plots, and neutral expressions as hidden agendas. The more they look, the more they find, reinforcing the growing paranoia. The brilliance of paranoia induction is in its self-fulfilling nature. The victim's increasing distrust alienates friends and allies who may grow frustrated or confused. The manipulator, meanwhile, often positions themselves as the only trustworthy person, deepening control. The victim becomes trapped in a cycle of anxiety and suspicion, unable to discern friend from foe. As paranoia takes hold, the victim's thoughts become a prison. They are consumed by what-ifs, convinced of hidden dangers lurking everywhere. This constant state of hypervigilance drains mental and emotional energy, leaving them vulnerable and dependent. The manipulator uses this fractured state to steer decisions, isolate the victim further, and maintain dominance, all while the victim battles ghosts of doubt conjured by their own mind. Persona fragmentation. Persona fragmentation is a psychological manipulation where a person's identity is subtly broken into conflicting pieces, forcing them to present different versions of themselves depending on the audience or situation. It's not simply about hiding aspects of who they are. It's about being coerced into living multiple, often contradictory selves, creating internal confusion and emotional exhaustion. The manipulator doesn't ask for authenticity. They demand adaptability at the cost of cohesion. This tactic often begins with the manipulator rewarding different behaviors in different contexts. At home, The victim must be compliant and quiet, at work, aggressive and ambitious, with friends, charming and agreeable. Each environment becomes a stage, and the victim becomes a chameleon, shifting colors to meet external demands. Over time, these shifts fragment the victim's core sense of self, leaving them unsure which version is the real one. The psychological toll is profound. Constantly wearing masks fractures emotional consistency and weakens self-trust. The victim may feel like a stranger to themselves, struggling to reconcile who they truly are beneath the layers imposed by others. This fragmentation opens the door to anxiety, depression, and identity crises as the boundaries between authentic self and performed roles blur. The manipulator benefits by maintaining control through this disorientation. A fragmented persona is easier to influence, less likely to resist, and more dependent on external validation. They exploit the victim's fractured identity to keep them off balance. Never whole, never fully empowered, the victim's struggle to integrate their scattered selves becomes the manipulator's quiet victory as autonomy fades into the background of performed personas. Emotional investment traps. Emotional investment traps are a psychological snare where manipulators draw victims into deep feelings of attachment and commitment, only to use that emotional capital against them later. The tactic begins by encouraging trust, sharing vulnerabilities, and creating moments of intimacy that feel genuine and safe. The victim pours their feelings, hopes, and time into the relationship, unaware they're building a reservoir of emotional debt that the manipulator can withdraw from at will. The manipulator carefully calibrates these investments, offering just enough warmth and connection to inspire hope and loyalty. They might reveal personal stories, give compliments, or share dreams that create the illusion of mutual vulnerability. This fosters a sense of exclusivity and specialness, making the victim believe they've found a rare bond worth protecting. But beneath this surface lies a subtle agenda to make the victim emotionally dependent and reluctant to question or leave. When the manipulator later withholds affection, dismisses concerns, or introduces chaos, the victim's investment becomes a chain. They fear losing what they've built and often blame themselves for any problems. The more emotionally invested they are, the stronger the pull to stay, to fix, to forgive. This trap doesn't rely on overt control or threats. It uses the victim's own heart as the leash. Over time, emotional investment traps distort boundaries and blur reality. The victim's sense of self-worth becomes entangled with the manipulator's approval. They sacrifice their needs to preserve the fragile connection. The manipulator maintains power not by force, but by holding the promise of love and the threat of its withdrawal within the victim's deepest emotional core. The drip feed discard. The drip feed discard is a cold and calculated psychological tactic where a manipulator slowly withdraws affection, attention, or support in small, barely noticeable increments rather than all at once. Instead of a sudden break, the victim experiences a gradual fading, each slight pullback creating confusion, self-doubt, and emotional desperation. The manipulator doesn't need drama or confrontation. They use silence and subtle absence as weapons to erode connection without clear explanation. This tactic often begins with tiny changes, delayed replies, less enthusiastic responses, canceled plans that become more frequent. The victim senses something is wrong, but struggles to pinpoint when or why. Each drip of withdrawal is just small enough to be dismissed or rationalized, but over time, these small losses accumulate into a crushing sense of abandonment. The genius of the drip feed discard lies in its psychological grip. The victim starts chasing what was lost, replaying moments to find signs of hope, and trying harder to regain the fading affection. They believe if they just do more, try harder, or change themselves, the connection will return to what it was. Meanwhile, the manipulator watches from a distance, wielding control without the messiness of outright rejection. Over time, this slow unraveling breaks down trust and self-esteem. The victim feels isolated, yet guilty for feeling hurt. They become emotionally tethered to a relationship that is quietly dying, unable to grasp the full reality until the bond is almost completely severed. The drip-feed discard doesn't end with a bang. It ends with the silence of someone who's been carefully taught that love can disappear drop by drop, unnoticed until it's too late. Intellectual shaming triggers. Intellectual shaming triggers are a psychological tactic where a manipulator subtly undermines a person's confidence by attacking their intelligence, ideas, or knowledge, often cloaked in sarcasm, condescension, or helpful corrections. The goal isn't honest critique, but to make the victim doubt their mental abilities and question their worth, making them less likely to assert themselves or challenge the manipulator in the future. This tactic often begins with seemingly innocent comments like, "You really don't understand this, do you?" or "Maybe you should read up more before speaking." Over time, these remarks chip away at the victim's confidence. They start hesitating to share opinions, fearing ridicule or dismissal. The manipulator may interrupt, talk over, or dismiss ideas as naive or foolish, all techniques that reinforce a sense of intellectual inferiority. What makes intellectual shaming so effective is its disguise as concern or humor. The manipulator might claim they're just joking or trying to help. This makes it hard for the victim to push back without seeming overly sensitive or defensive. The subtle attacks become internalized as self-criticism, turning the victim's own mind into a battleground of doubt and anxiety. As the victim's intellectual confidence erodes, their voice becomes quieter and their willingness to challenge authority or stand up for themselves diminishes. The manipulator gains control not through force, but by silencing thought and expression, making the victim question not only what they say, but if they can say anything at all without being shamed. Covert fragility exposure. Covert fragility exposure is a manipulative psychological technique where a person's vulnerabilities, insecurities, or weaknesses are subtly and secretly revealed, often without their knowledge, to others, weakening their social standing and emotional defenses. Unlike direct attacks, this tactic operates in the shadows, turning private struggles into weapons of silent control. The manipulator doesn't confront openly. They expose quietly, creating cracks in the victim's armor that others can exploit. This exposure often happens through careless or strategically leaked information. A seemingly innocent comment about someone's anxiety or past mistakes is shared with just enough emphasis to plant doubt or pity. Trusted conversations are subtly twisted into gossip. Private fears become public knowledge. The victim's fragility, once hidden, becomes a tool the manipulator uses to undermine confidence and isolate them socially or emotionally. The power of covert fragility exposure lies in its invisibility. The victim often doesn't realize their weaknesses have been broadcast until the consequences unfold. Friends pulling away, colleagues doubting their competence, or family members treating them differently. Meanwhile, the manipulator maintains plausible deniability, pretending innocence or feigned concern, deepening the victim's confusion and mistrust. Over time, this silent unveiling erodes the victim's sense of safety and self-worth. They become hypervigilant, guarded, and anxious, knowing that their vulnerabilities might be weaponized at any moment. The manipulator, meanwhile, tightens control by fostering isolation and insecurity, ensuring the victim remains fragile and dependent. Covert fragility exposure isn't just betrayal. It's a calculated erosion of identity, disguised as careless talk or concern. Memory alteration through suggestion. Memory alteration through suggestion is a covert psychological technique where a manipulator subtly influences or reshapes another person's recollection of events, blurring the line between truth and fiction in the victim's mind. It doesn't rely on outright lies, but on planting seeds of doubt, rephrasing details, or repeatedly presenting an alternate version of reality until the victim begins to question their own memory and accept the manipulator's narrative as fact. This tactic often starts with seemingly innocent questions or statements like, "Are you sure it happened that way?" or "I remember it differently." The manipulator may then provide vivid but inaccurate descriptions, confuse timelines, or highlight details that never occurred. Over time, the victim's confidence in their own recollection weakens, making them vulnerable to further manipulation and control. What makes memory alteration so dangerous is how deeply it affects identity and trust. Our memories shape who we are, how we relate to others, and how we make decisions. When those memories are twisted, the victim may doubt not only past events, but also their present judgments and emotions. They may apologize for things they didn't do or accept blame unjustly. Repeated suggestion can lead to false memories, vivid, detailed beliefs in events that never occurred. The victim may defend these altered memories fiercely, unaware that they are no longer anchored in reality. Meanwhile, the manipulator gains power by controlling the very fabric of what the victim perceives as truth, turning recollection into a weapon that isolates, confuses, and subjugates. Innocence weaponization. Innocence weaponization is a manipulative psychological strategy where a person uses their perceived naivety, purity, or victimhood as a shield and a weapon simultaneously. The manipulator presents themselves as harmless, vulnerable, or morally untouchable, making it difficult for others to question or confront them without feeling guilty or unfair. This innocence isn't genuine helplessness. It's a carefully crafted facade designed to disarm critics and control narratives. At its core, innocence weaponization exploits social norms around kindness, protection, and trust. When someone appears too pure or too good to cause harm, others hesitate to challenge them, even in the face of clear manipulation or wrongdoing. The manipulator might express confusion, hurt feelings, or naivety as a response to criticism, turning the tables and making the accuser seem cruel or unjust. This tactic often invites sympathy, deflects responsibility, and discourages accountability. The brilliance of this technique lies in its subtlety. The manipulator rarely admits to manipulation outright. Instead, they mask control with charm, feigned ignorance, or appeals to shared values. They may use phrases like, "I didn't mean to upset anyone," or "I just don't understand why this is a problem," prompting others to lower their guard or question their own perceptions. Over time, innocence weaponization erodes boundaries and distorts relationships. The victim, or the accused, feels trapped between defending themselves and avoiding harm to someone who seems so fragile. The manipulator's innocence becomes a fortress, protecting their power while making others feel responsible for maintaining it. In this way, what appears to be harmless vulnerability becomes a potent tool of dominance cloaked in purity. Selective affection bombing. Selective affection bombing is a manipulative strategy where warmth, love, and attention are given inconsistently and strategically to keep someone emotionally hooked and uncertain. Unlike constant love bombing, which overwhelms with affection, selective affection bombing offers intermittent bursts of kindness and praise, rewarding compliance, masking abuse, or regaining control after conflict. This unpredictable pattern creates a powerful psychological pull, making the victim crave the next moment of affection, despite ongoing pain or neglect. The manipulator might shower the victim with compliments, gifts, or intimate moments after a fight or period of coldness, only to withdraw again soon after. These brief returns of warmth feel like lifelines, reinforcing hope that the relationship can be fixed or that the manipulator truly cares. The victim, desperate to maintain connection, often tolerates mistreatment or ignores red flags, focusing instead on the rare moments of kindness. This tactic exploits the brain's reward system. The sudden release of positive emotion after deprivation creates a cycle similar to addiction, where the victim chases the next high of affection. The unpredictability heightens anxiety and attachment, making it difficult to break free from the cycle. Over time, selective affection bombing erodes self-worth and clarity. The victim doubts their own judgment, wondering if they're overreacting or if the manipulator's love is real. They may sacrifice boundaries, self-care, and personal values to earn the next burst of affection. The manipulator doesn't need constant approval. They only need to keep affection scarce and unpredictable, turning love into a tool for control rather than connection. Double-bind programming. Double-bind programming is a psychological trap where a person is placed in a no-win situation, forced to respond to two conflicting demands or messages where any choice leads to punishment, criticism, or emotional pain. It's a form of manipulation that creates impossible expectations, leaving the victim confused, paralyzed, and desperate to find a right answer that doesn't exist. The manipulator doesn't need to make direct threats. They simply set contradictory rules and watch as the victim struggles to comply. This tactic often surfaces in relationships with messages like, "Be spontaneous, but don't be reckless," or "You need to talk to me more, but don't bother me when I'm busy." No matter what the victim does, they're accused of failing. Speak up and you're labeled aggressive. Stay quiet and you're called distant. The victim learns that honesty leads to conflict, but silence leads to neglect. The real danger of double-bind programming is how it undermines trust in one's own judgment. When every choice seems wrong, the victim begins to doubt their perception and reasoning. They may feel trapped between pleasing others and maintaining self-respect, eventually surrendering both to avoid the emotional whiplash. Over time, this erodes confidence and fosters learned helplessness. Manipulators use this tactic to maintain control without overt force. The contradictions keep the victim off balance, reliant on the manipulator's approval and guidance. Because the rules are impossible to satisfy, the victim often internalizes blame, believing they are inherently flawed. Double-bind programming doesn't just create confusion, it rewires the mind to accept that no decision is truly safe, making resistance feel futile and submission inevitable. Scarcity of safety conditioning. Scarcity of safety conditioning is a psychological manipulation technique where a manipulator deliberately makes feelings of security, comfort, and emotional safety rare and unpredictable, creating an environment where the victim constantly craves stability but never fully attains it. Instead of offering consistent reassurance, the manipulator dangles safety like a scarce resource, conditioning the victim to work harder, bend further, and tolerate more just to grasp fleeting moments of peace. This tactic begins by making the victim's emotional needs difficult to meet. Warmth and kindness appear sporadically after tests, conflicts, or displays of submission, never as a steady baseline. The victim learns that safety isn't guaranteed but must be earned, often by anticipating moods, censoring themselves, or avoiding actions that might trigger withdrawal or anger. This unpredictability turns what should be a fundamental human need into a fragile prize. The power of scarcity lies in its psychological effect. When something is rare or uncertain, its perceived value skyrockets. The victim clings desperately to those rare moments of safety, even if they come attached to pain or confusion. Over time, the brain's stress response becomes chronic as the victim remains in a heightened state of alert, constantly scanning for threats and adjusting behavior to avoid emotional harm. Scarcity of safety conditioning doesn't just control behavior, it rewires trust. The victim stops expecting security as a given and begins to accept instability as normal. They become emotionally dependent, not on love or kindness, but on the manipulator's unpredictable granting of relief. And the manipulator, they hold the keys to a fortress of safety that's never fully unlocked, ensuring control by keeping peace always just out of reach. Possession, disguised as protection. Possession disguised as protection is a subtle but damaging psychological tactic where control and domination are masked as care, concern, or safeguarding. The manipulator presents their need to limit, monitor, or decide for someone else as an act of love or protection, convincing the victim that giving up freedom is necessary for safety. This creates a dependency wrapped in the illusion of security, where boundaries are erased under the guise of keeping the person safe from harm. At its core, this tactic exploits natural human desires for safety and belonging. The manipulator might say, "I'm just looking out for you," or, "If I didn't set these rules, something bad would happen." The victim begins to accept restrictions, not because they want to, but because they fear the consequences of independence. Limits on friendships, decisions, or activities are framed as care, making dissent feel selfish or reckless. The brilliance of possession disguised as protection is in its emotional leverage. The manipulator becomes both guardian and gatekeeper, defining what's allowed and what's dangerous. The victim's trust is weaponized to justify control. Over time, they may lose sight of their own needs, believing that freedom equals risk and that surrendering autonomy is a form of love. This dynamic erodes self-trust and fosters learned helplessness. The victim's identity shrinks to fit within the safe boundaries prescribed by the manipulator. They may feel grateful for protection while simultaneously feeling trapped. The manipulator doesn't present as a tyrant, but as a savior, making control not only palatable, but seemingly essential for survival and emotional well-being. Emotional redirection loop. Emotional redirection loop is a manipulative, psychological pattern where the manipulator diverts the victim's feelings away from the true source of hurt or conflict and channels them toward confusion, self-doubt, or misplaced guilt. Instead of addressing the real issue, the manipulator twists the emotional energy, turning it back on the victim or onto irrelevant concerns, trapping them in a cycle where their feelings are never fully processed or resolved. This tactic begins when the victim expresses hurt, anger, or disappointment. Rather than acknowledging these emotions, the manipulator redirects attention with phrases like, "Why are you always so sensitive?" or "I'm the one who's been patient here." This shifts the emotional weight away from the manipulator's behavior and onto the victim's character or actions. The victim's natural response is to question their own feelings or apologize, starting the loop. The brilliance of the emotional redirection loop lies in how it disrupts clarity and healing. The victim's energy that should be used to process their pain is instead recycled into defending themselves, soothing the manipulator, or navigating the shifting emotional landscape. Each attempt to resolve feelings leads them back to confusion or self-blame, reinforcing the cycle. Over time, the victim becomes trapped in this loop, unable to break free from the constant redirection of their emotional responses. Their authentic feelings get lost or dismissed, and their emotional needs remain unmet. Meanwhile, the manipulator maintains control not by force, but by keeping the victim spinning, exhausted, uncertain, and emotionally tethered to the very source of their distress. Reverse silence as psychological blade. Silence as psychological blade is a sharp and cutting form of manipulation where withholding communication becomes a weapon used to punish, control, or unsettle another person without a single word spoken. Unlike open conflict, this silence slices deep through absence, creating anxiety, guilt, and desperation in the victim as they are left to wrestle with the unknown. The manipulator wields silence like a knife, shaping emotional pain through what is not said. This tactic often unfolds gradually. A text goes unanswered. A door is closed without explanation. Eye contact fades into cold avoidance. The victim, craving connection or resolution, fills the void with worst-case scenarios, replaying interactions and blaming themselves. Every unanswered question becomes a wound, every pause a threat. The silence forces the victim to seek permission to feel or speak, creating a power imbalance where the manipulator controls the flow of emotional safety. What makes silence such a potent blade is its ambiguity. The victim cannot argue with silence. They cannot negotiate with absence. They are left trapped in their own thoughts, caught between wanting to reach out and fearing more rejection. This limbo breeds insecurity and compliance as the victim alters behavior to avoid triggering the next silent punishment. Over time, silence as psychological blade damages self-esteem and communication patterns. Victims learn to fear speaking up, equating expression with potential harm. The manipulator doesn't need to shout, threaten, or criticize. They simply withdraw, letting the quiet do the cutting. And in that space, control is absolute, wielded not by words, but by the heavy weight of what remains unspoken. Suffering, comparison, leverage. Suffering comparison leverage is a psychological manipulation technique where a manipulator diminishes or invalidates another person's pain by contrasting it with their own or others' suffering, forcing the victim into a position of guilt, shame, or silence. Instead of acknowledging someone's experience, the manipulator reframes it as less important, not as bad, or something others have it worse, effectively silencing the victim and controlling the narrative of who deserves empathy. This tactic often begins with phrases like, "You think that's hard? Try dealing with what I've been through," or "At least you're not facing what others have." These comments don't just minimize feelings, they create a hierarchy of suffering where the victim feels unworthy of support. The victim's pain is no longer valid on its own terms, but only in comparison, and always found lacking. The power of suffering comparison leverage lies in how it exploits empathy and social norms. People naturally want to avoid appearing self-centered or ungrateful, so when their pain is dismissed as less, they tend to withdraw rather than argue. They silence themselves to avoid conflict or feelings of guilt, often internalizing the message that their emotions aren't legitimate or important. Over time, this dynamic erodes self-esteem and trust. The victim doubts their own experiences and stops seeking help or expressing needs. The manipulator uses suffering as a tool, not to connect but to dominate, ensuring that empathy flows primarily toward themselves, while the victim's wounds remain invisible, unheard, and unhealed. Misplaced accountability framing. Misplaced accountability framing is a psychological manipulation technique where responsibility for problems, conflicts, or failures is unfairly shifted onto the victim, making them feel guilty or at fault for issues they didn't cause. The manipulator doesn't admit blame or examine their own role. Instead, they craft a narrative where the victim's actions, feelings, or reactions become the real problem, effectively reversing roles and confusing the sense of justice. This tactic often begins subtly. A simple disagreement turns into, "If only you had listened better," or "You always make things harder than they need to be." When the victim raises legitimate concerns, they're accused of being overly sensitive or unreasonable. The manipulator paints themselves as reasonable, while the victim is cast as the obstacle. Over time, this constant reframing erodes the victim's confidence in their own perspective and judgment. The brilliance of misplaced accountability framing is in its distortion of cause and effect. The victim starts to internalize blame for things beyond their control, questioning whether they're the source of dysfunction. They may apologize unnecessarily, change behavior to fix problems that aren't theirs, or stay silent to avoid conflict. the manipulator maintains a position of innocence and moral superiority without ever having to take real responsibility. This dynamic deeply undermines healthy boundaries and communication. The victim becomes hypervigilant, walking on eggshells to avoid triggering blame. They may suppress their needs and emotions to maintain peace. Meanwhile, the manipulator's control grows, rooted not in force, but in the victim's willingness to carry a burden that isn't theirs to bear. Misplaced accountability framing isn't just deception, it's a systematic rewriting of reality that keeps the victim trapped in guilt and compliance. Projection intensity amplification. Projection intensity amplification is a manipulative psychological tactic where a person projects their own unacceptable feelings, flaws, or intentions onto someone else, but does so with such force and exaggeration that it overwhelms and confuses the victim. Instead of merely shifting blame, the manipulator amplifies the projection to an extreme degree, making the victim question their own behavior and reality while diverting attention from their own faults. This technique often begins subtly, with the manipulator accusing the victim of thoughts, emotions, or actions they themselves are guilty of. But rather than a simple accusation, the manipulator magnifies it, painting the victim as selfish, dishonest, or malicious in ways that seem unbelievable. The victim, shocked and defensive, struggles to respond to the intense and often relentless criticism. Over time, the barrage wears down their confidence, making them doubt their self-awareness and sanity. The brilliance of projection intensity amplification lies in its emotional force. The overwhelming nature of the accusations leaves little room for the victim to express their truth or defend themselves without seeming defensive or guilty. The louder and more intense the projection, the more it silences opposition. The manipulator controls the narrative by drowning out reality with noise. Over time, victims internalize the exaggerated projections, questioning their own character and behavior. They become hypervigilant, overly cautious, and eager to avoid triggering further attacks. Meanwhile, the manipulator maintains control not by admitting fault, but by amplifying blame, turning their own flaws into weapons and making the victim carry the burden of guilt and confusion. Intimacy bait withdrawal. Intimacy bait withdrawal is a psychological manipulation tactic where closeness and affection are deliberately offered as a lure, only to be suddenly pulled away, leaving the victim craving connection and desperate to regain it. The manipulator uses moments of warmth, vulnerability, or shared secrets to hook the target emotionally, then withholds that intimacy to create confusion, insecurity, and dependency. It's not about genuine bonding. It's about control through emotional hunger. This tactic often begins with intense closeness. The manipulator shares private thoughts, compliments, or affectionate gestures that feel rare and special. The victim feels seen, valued, and connected in ways they may have never experienced before. But just as trust builds, the manipulator withdraws, ignoring calls, withholding affection, or becoming distant without explanation. The sudden absence creates a void that feels like rejection, sparking anxiety and a desperate need to restore what was lost. The brilliance of intimacy bait withdrawal lies in its cyclical nature. Each return of closeness feels like a reward, each withdrawal a punishment. The victim becomes trapped in a loop, trying harder to earn affection, questioning their worth when it's withheld, and interpreting silence as a personal failing. The manipulator doesn't need to threaten or coerce. They simply turn emotional connection into a fluctuating currency that keeps the victim emotionally off balance. Over time, this cycle erodes the victim's self-esteem and autonomy. They begin to equate love with uncertainty and closeness with conditionality. The manipulator's power grows not because of what they say, but because of what they choose to give or refuse in moments that feel most intimate. In this dynamic, vulnerability becomes a trap, and the promise of connection a carefully wielded weapon. Deceptive reciprocity control. Deceptive reciprocity control is a psychological manipulation technique where the manipulator exploits the natural human tendency to return kindness or favors, but twists it into a trap that creates unequal emotional debt. The manipulator gives selectively, creating a sense of obligation in the victim, but their generosity always comes with hidden strings attached. The victim feels compelled to reciprocate, not out of genuine desire, but from a pressure to repay what was given, even when it's used against them later. This tactic often starts with grand gestures or unexpected favors that feel genuine and generous. The victim accepts, grateful and trusting, but over time, these acts become tools of control. The manipulator reminds the victim, sometimes subtly, sometimes openly, of what they've done, leveraging that past generosity to demand compliance, silence, or sacrifice. The victim's attempts to reciprocate feel insufficient, creating a perpetual imbalance that favors the manipulator. The genius of deceptive reciprocity lies in how it abuses social norms. Humans are wired to avoid indebtedness and to maintain balanced relationships. The manipulator weaponizes this by making the victim feel guilty for saying no or for setting boundaries. The victim becomes trapped in a cycle of giving and owing, unable to break free without feeling ungrateful or disloyal. Over time, this pattern erodes autonomy and trust. The victim's sense of free will shrinks as they prioritize repayment over their own needs. The manipulator maintains dominance, not through force, but through a twisted economy of favors, where kindness is currency and the price is control. Shame-based silence. Induction. Shame-based silence induction is a psychological tactic where a manipulator uses feelings of shame to silence someone, pressuring them into withholding thoughts, feelings, or objections to avoid judgment, rejection, or humiliation. Instead of openly forbidding expression, the manipulator creates an environment where the victim chooses silence out of fear of being shamed, making silence a self-imposed prison fueled by guilt. This method often starts subtly. A critical look, a dismissive comment, or a sarcastic remark suggests that speaking up is wrong or embarrassing. The victim might hear phrases like, "Why would you even say that?" or "You're making a big deal out of nothing." These statements plant doubt and self-consciousness, teaching the victim that their voice is not only unwelcome, but shameful. The power of shame-based silence lies in its internalization. The victim begins to police themselves, censoring thoughts before they're even spoken. They avoid difficult conversations, suppress true feelings, and minimize their needs to stay acceptable. The silence isn't forced. It's carefully cultivated as the safest option. Over time, this conditioning damages confidence and communication. The victim feels isolated, disconnected, and unable to assert boundaries. The manipulator maintains control by ensuring that emotional expression becomes risky and silence becomes the path of least resistance. In this way, shame-based silence induction transforms guilt into a leash, keeping the victim muted and the manipulator firmly in command without ever having to raise their voice. Love withdrawal addiction. Love withdrawal addiction is a manipulative dynamic where the manipulator intermittently removes affection, attention, or approval to create an emotional dependency in the victim. Rather than constant warmth, love is used as a scarce resource, given sparingly and unpredictably, triggering cravings, anxiety, and desperate attempts to regain the lost connection. The victim becomes addicted not to love itself, but to the manipulator's approval and the relief that comes when affection is restored. This cycle often begins with the manipulator showing deep care and validation, which feels rewarding and safe. But then, affection is suddenly pulled back, ignored texts, cold silence, distant behavior. The the victim experiences withdrawal symptoms, confusion, self-doubt, fear of abandonment. In response, they increase efforts to please, appease, or fix the relationship, hoping to bring back the warmth. The addiction forms because the brain's reward system is hijacked by the unpredictability of affection. The sporadic return of love releases dopamine, reinforcing the behavior of chasing connection. The victim tolerates neglect, excuses harmful behavior, and sacrifices boundaries, all to avoid the pain of emotional starvation. Over time, love withdrawal addiction undermines self-esteem and autonomy. The victim feels powerless, trapped in a cycle where their emotional well-being depends on the manipulator's whims. The manipulator doesn't need to threaten or coerce directly. They just withhold love strategically, turning affection itself into a tool of control and deepening the victim's dependency with every withheld touch, word, or glance.